The apartment next door had been empty for a few weeks, the previous tenants leaving without much notice. I hadn't known them well, just a polite nod in the hallway or the occasional shared complaint about the noisy pipes. Still, their sudden departure felt abrupt, like they'd been in a hurry to get out. One evening, as I was coming home, I noticed the door to their apartment was slightly ajar. It wasn't much, just a crack wide enough to see a sliver of darkness inside. I figured maybe the landlord was cleaning or showing the place, but there was no one in the hallway, and I didn't hear any voices coming from inside. For reasons I couldn't quite explain, I paused. I stood there for a moment, staring at the door, my hand hovering over my own keys. Something about it felt wrong. Not dangerous, exactly, but off, like the air around it was heavier than it should have been. I shook off the feeling and went inside. It wasn't my business, and I wasn't about to go snooping around someone else's empty apartment. But that night, as I lay in bed, I thought I heard something, a faint noise, just on the edge of perception. It sounded like whispering, though I couldn't make out the words. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind or the building settling, and eventually drifted off to sleep. The next day, I noticed the door was still open, not just ajar this time, but wide open, as if inviting someone to step inside. I glanced around the hallway, half expecting to see the landlord or maybe the maintenance guy, but it was empty, just me and that open door. Against my better judgment, I took a step closer. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing faintly in the hallway. There was no response. I peered inside, expecting to see an empty apartment, bare walls and carpet. But what I saw made me stop cold. The apartment wasn't empty. It was fully furnished, though not in the way you'd expect. The furniture looked old, mismatched. An antique wooden table here, a faded armchair there, and everything was covered in a fine layer of dust. The air smelled stale, like it hadn't been touched in years, and yet there was a sense of presence, like someone had been there just moments ago. That's when I noticed the photographs. They were everywhere, lining the walls, propped up on every surface, even scattered across the floor. All black and white, all in simple wooden frames. And all of them showed the same thing. The apartment I was standing in, I stepped inside, my curiosity overriding my common sense. The photos weren't just of the apartment, though. They captured moments, objects slightly out of place, shadows in corners, the furniture shifting subtly from frame to frame. It was like someone had been documenting the room obsessively, over and over, from every angle. I picked up one of the photos from the floor, my fingers trembling slightly. At first, it looked like all the others, a shot of the living room, taken from a corner near the ceiling. But then I noticed something in the background, a figure. It was blurry, barely more than a smudge of gray against the wallpaper, but it was unmistakably human, tall, thin, with arms that seemed too long for its body. It was standing just behind the armchair, half hidden in shadow. I dropped the photo and backed away, suddenly aware of how quiet the apartment was. No hum of electricity, no creaking of the old pipes. Just silence, thick and oppressive. That's when I saw the mirror. It was hanging on the far wall, an ornate, oval-shaped thing with a gilded frame. Unlike everything else in the apartment, it wasn't dusty. The glass was spotless, reflecting the room with perfect clarity. But as I stared at it, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. My reflection wasn't moving. I froze, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. In the mirror, I was standing perfectly still, my arms at my sides, even though I was backing toward the door. The reflection's eyes were fixed on me, unblinking, as if watching. Then it smiled. I don't remember leaving the apartment. One moment I was standing there, staring at that impossibly still reflection, and the next I was back in my own apartment, the door locked behind me. I tried to convince myself it had been a hallucination, a trick of the light, but the memory of that smile stayed with me, vivid and wrong. That night, I dreamed of the apartment. I was standing in the living room again, surrounded by the photos, but this time, the figures in the pictures weren't blurry. They were sharp, detailed, their faces pale and featureless. They were all staring directly at me. When I woke up, the smell of dust and old wood lingered in my room, and on my nightstand, where I'd left my phone and a glass of water, there was a photograph. It was black and white, framed in simple wood. The image showed my bedroom, taken from the corner near the ceiling, and in the background, just behind the bed, was the same figure I'd seen in the first photo. Tall, thin, watching. I didn't sleep after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the faint sound of whispering, growing louder and louder until it filled my head. I started seeing shadows where there shouldn't have been any, reflections that didn't quite match my movements. The door to the apartment is still open. I see it every time I pass by, though I've stopped looking inside. I don't need to. I can feel it now, the weight of its presence pressing against my mind. The photos are still appearing. Every morning, there's a new one waiting for me, always of my apartment, always with that figure in the background. I've stopped trying to throw them away. They always come back, and every time I look at them, the figure is closer. I don't know how this ends, but I think the apartment wants me back. It wasn't anything dramatic, just a small piece of paper slipped under my apartment door one Wednesday morning. I thought it might be from the landlord about maintenance, or maybe a misplaced flyer for a local event. But when I picked it up, the handwriting stopped me cold. It was small and precise, the kind of neatness you only see in textbooks or old letters, and it simply said, "I like the way your lights look at night." I stared at it for a moment, confused. It was odd but not threatening. Maybe someone had meant it as a compliment? I shrugged it off, tossed the note in the trash, and went about my day. That night, as I settled into bed, I glanced out the window. I live on the 4th floor, overlooking a quiet street where the glow of my apartment stands out against the darker buildings around me. I couldn't help but feel exposed, as though someone might be watching. Pulling the curtains closed, I told myself it was nothing. People notice things. It doesn't mean anything. But the notes didn't stop. The second one appeared 3 days later. This time, it was folded in half and left on my car windshield. I almost didn't notice it until I was about to drive to work. When I opened it, my stomach turned. "Your curtains are nice, but I liked it better when they were open." I locked my doors, my mind racing. Was someone watching me? The thought sent an icy ripple down my spine. I started to question everyone in my building. Was it the older woman in 4B who always smiled too widely in the elevator? The teenage boy from 2C who listened to music too loudly? It could have been anyone, or maybe no one. That night, I kept the curtains tightly shut. I even checked every window twice before heading to bed. But sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the building made me jump, and I swore I heard footsteps outside my door more than once. By the time the third note arrived, I was starting to unravel. It was taped to my door this time, bold and shameless. "You don't need to hide. I'd like to see you smile again." I didn't even remember smiling. Not at home, anyway. The thought of someone studying me, tracking these little details, made my skin crawl. I reported it to the landlord, but he brushed it off. "Probably some kid pulling a prank," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "Don't worry about it." Don't worry about it? Easy for him to say. He wasn't the one getting personalized letters from an invisible stalker. I considered calling the police, but what would I say? "Hi, someone keeps writing creepy but technically not illegal notes about my curtains?" It felt absurd. I told a couple of friends, but they just laughed nervously and told me to stay safe, which didn't help. The next week passed uneventfully, and I started to relax. Maybe whoever it was had gotten bored and moved on. I kept my routines as normal as I could, though I checked my windows and locks obsessively. Then, just when I thought it was over, something new happened. I came home late after work one evening to find my apartment unlocked. At first, I thought I'd forgotten to lock it. I even told myself that, repeating it like a mantra as I slowly pushed the door open. The apartment looked the same. No broken windows, no signs of forced entry. But as I stepped inside, a strange sensation prickled at the back of my neck. Everything was too quiet. I walked from room to room, checking closets, under the bed, even behind the shower curtain. Nothing. But when I went to the living room, I stopped cold. The note was waiting for me, neatly placed on the coffee table. "You should get more sleep. You look tired." I stood there, frozen, my pulse pounding in my ears. Someone had been inside. Someone had been close enough to see me, to know me. I called the police this time, shaking as I explained everything. They sent an officer who walked through the apartment, asked me a few questions, and jotted everything down in a small notepad. "No signs of forced entry," he said. "Could be someone you know with a key?" I didn't have many visitors, and the only spare key I'd given out was to the landlord. But suggesting that felt crazy, so I just shook my head. "I don't think so." The officer left after that, promising to follow up, but the hollow feeling in my chest told me nothing would come of it. The next day, I had the locks changed and installed a second deadbolt for good measure. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. 2 days later, another note appeared. This time, it was tucked inside my mailbox. "I don't like the new locks. They don't suit you." I stopped sleeping after that. How could I? Someone out there wasn't just watching me. They were inside my life, slipping past every barrier I put up. I thought about leaving, about packing up and disappearing, but the idea of running felt like letting them win. Instead, I bought a small camera and set it up in my living room. If they came back, I'd finally have proof. For 3 nights, the camera recorded nothing but the silent, empty apartment. By the 4th night, I started to think I'd scared them off. But when I reviewed the footage the next morning, my stomach dropped. There, at exactly 3:14 a.m., was a figure standing in the middle of my living room. They weren't moving, just standing there in the darkness, their heads slightly tilted as if listening. The camera didn't catch their face, just the faint outline of their body. After 2 full minutes, they turned and walked toward the hallway, toward my bedroom. I don't remember much after that. I grabbed my phone, my bag, and my car keys and drove. I didn't stop until I was 2 towns away, in a dingy motel where the walls smelled like mildew but felt blissfully anonymous. It's been a week, and I haven't gone back. The landlord called to ask about my rent, but I ignored him. I don't even know if I'll go back for my things. Last night, as I was checking into a new motel, the receptionist handed me my room key with a smile. "By the way," she said, sliding a small note across the counter, "someone left this for you earlier." It was folded neatly, written in that same precise, familiar handwriting. "Running won't change anything. I'll always know where to find you." I never believed in doppelgangers. I'd heard the stories, your uncanny double appearing out of nowhere, a bad omen or a cosmic glitch. But those were just stories. Until last summer, when I met mine. It started at a grocery store 2 towns over. I was picking up supplies for a camping trip, browsing the snack aisle, when a woman stopped mid-step and stared at me like she'd seen a ghost. "Emily," she said, her voice trembling. "No," I replied, confused. "I'm not Emily. Sorry." Her face twisted in disbelief. "You have to be. Emily Harper. We went to high school together." I shook my head, feeling a little uneasy. "I think you've got the wrong person." She stood there for a moment, her eyes scanning my face like she was trying to find some flaw in her own memory. Finally, she mumbled an apology and walked away, but I could feel her glancing back at me. The encounter left me shaken, but I brushed it off. People mistake strangers for others all the time. I'd seen it happen. 2 days later, I went for a hike in a nearby state park. I was halfway up the trail, the sun beating down on my back, when I noticed someone ahead of me. A woman, wearing a bright red jacket. She was moving quickly, her head down, but something about her seemed familiar. As I got closer, my heart skipped a beat. She looked exactly like me. Same brown hair, same build, even the same way of walking, like she was always in a hurry. I stopped in my tracks, frozen with disbelief. "Hey!" I called out. The woman turned to look at me. It was like looking into a mirror. Her face mirrored my own. Every detail, down to the tiny scar above my eyebrow that I got when I was 10. My breath caught in my throat. She stared at me for a moment, her expression unreadable, then turned and took off down a side path, disappearing into the woods. I stood there, too stunned to move. Was it a trick of the light? My mind playing games? I forced myself to keep walking, but the image of her face, my face, lingered in my head the entire way back to my car. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her. The next day, I decided to tell my best friend, Megan. She laughed at first, but when she saw how serious I was, her face fell. That's weird, she said. Maybe she was a distant relative? People say we all have a twin somewhere. Maybe, I replied, though I didn't believe it. Megan tried to lighten the mood. If I see her, I'll make sure she's not plotting to steal your identity. Her joke didn't land. A week passed, and I didn't see the woman again. I started to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing, that my brain had glitched, or that I'd run into someone who just happened to look like me. But then the notes started showing up. The first one was taped to my front door. It was written on plain white paper, in handwriting that looked eerily like my own. I saw you. Stop looking for me. I stared at the note for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Who would leave something like this? And how did they know where I lived? The second note appeared in my mailbox 2 days later. Stay away. You don't want to know. My chest tightened. I hadn't told anyone else about the woman in the woods. Not even Megan. By the time the third note arrived, this one slipped under my bedroom door while I slept. I was terrified. It read, "You've been warned." I started locking every door and window, keeping my curtains drawn at all times. I barely left the house, jumping at every sound. But none of that stopped her. One night, I woke up to the sound of tapping on my window. My bedroom is on the second floor. Heart pounding, I grabbed my phone and edged toward the window, careful not to make a sound. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate. When I finally pulled back the curtain, I felt the blood drain from my face. She was there, clinging to the side of the house like a spider, her face pressed against the glass. My face. She grinned, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was cold, hungry. I screamed and stumbled back, fumbling with my phone to call 911. When I looked back at the window, she was gone. The police arrived a short while later, but they didn't find anything. No footprints, no fingerprints, nothing. They chalked it up to a bad dream, suggested I get some rest. I didn't sleep that night. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences escalated. I'd come home to find items in my house moved, my belongings rearranged. Once, I found my favorite sweater draped over a chair, even though I hadn't worn it in months. I started hearing footsteps at odd hours, faint whispers coming from the walls. One evening, I was sorting through old photo albums, desperate for some kind of connection or clue. That's when I found it. A picture of me as a child, standing in front of a lake I didn't recognize. Beside me was another girl. She looked just like me, except for one detail. Her eyes were black. Not dark brown, not hazel, but black, like empty voids. I stared at the photo, my hands trembling. I didn't remember the girl, didn't remember the lake, didn't even remember taking the picture. But there it was, proof that she'd been part of my life long before I'd met her in the woods. That night, I packed a bag and drove to Megan's house. I didn't tell her the whole story, just that I needed a place to stay for a few days. She didn't ask questions, sensing my desperation. The next morning, Megan called me into the living room. She was pale, holding her phone with a shaky hand. "Did you go out last night?" she asked. "No," I said. She handed me her phone. On the screen was a photo from her security camera, taken around 2 a.m. It showed me standing on her front porch, staring directly into the camera, but I hadn't left the house. And the woman in the photo? She was smiling. I found it one morning, bright yellow, the ink slightly smudged. It read, "Don't forget to feed the cat." Harmless enough, except for one thing. I didn't own a cat. I laughed it off, thinking maybe I'd stuck it there during some sleep-deprived moment and forgotten. Maybe it was a remnant from the previous tenant. Either way, I left it there because it amused me. Every time I opened the fridge that day, it gave me a little chuckle. The next morning, there was another post-it note. Same bright yellow, same smudged ink. This one read, "Keep the bedroom window shut." Okay, weird. I was 100% sure I hadn't written that one. And the handwriting? It wasn't mine. It was close, but just off enough to make my skin prickle. Slightly slanted, like someone trying to mimic my style but not quite nailing it. I checked the locks on all the doors and windows, paced the apartment, and told myself I was being ridiculous. Maybe a prank? Someone sneaking in? But the deadbolt was secure, and the windows hadn't been tampered with. Still, I kept the bedroom window shut that night, just in case. The notes kept coming. Every morning a new one. Turn off the stove before bed. Don't answer the phone after 11. Throw out the milk. It's gone bad. That one was especially creepy because when I checked, the milk had expired a day earlier. I hadn't noticed before. Who was doing this? How did they know? I started sleeping with a knife under my pillow and checking the apartment every night. But there was no sign of forced entry. Nothing was missing or out of place, except for the notes. And then they escalated. One morning, I found one that simply said, "Leave the apartment tonight." Leave? Why? I stared at it for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Was it a warning? A threat? I decided not to listen. Leaving meant giving in to whoever was behind this, and I wasn't going to let them win. That night, as I sat on the couch, every nerve in my body felt on edge. The quiet was suffocating. Even the hum of the fridge seemed louder than usual. At exactly 11:57 p.m., my phone buzzed. Unknown number. My heart jumped into my throat. I didn't answer. 3 minutes later, the building's fire alarm went off. The high-pitched wail pierced through the silence, and I bolted upright, adrenaline coursing through me. Smoke detectors didn't usually go off randomly, right? My brain screamed at me to leave, but my legs felt glued to the floor. What if it was a trap? The alarm stopped abruptly after a minute. The silence that followed was even worse. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning's note read, "You're running out of time." Something shifted after that. The notes began appearing in places I hadn't even been. One on my bathroom mirror, "Do not look in the closet." Another inside the fridge, "Stop leaving the lights on." I found one in my coat pocket as I walked to work. "It's closer than you think." It was no longer confined to my apartment. That's when I started losing track of time. I'd sit down to watch TV, and what felt like 10 minutes later, it would be 3 hours. I'd wake up in the morning and find mud on my shoes, even though I hadn't left the apartment. One night, I woke up at 3 a.m. to find a post-it note stuck to my forehead. "It's in the walls." I nearly screamed. My hands trembled as I peeled it off. The ink wasn't smudged this time. It was fresh, the letters glistening in the moonlight streaming through my bedroom window. That's when I started hearing the scratching. It was faint at first, like nails on drywall, coming from the walls. Then it got louder, more insistent, as if something was trying to dig its way out. I tried banging on the wall, shouting, but it didn't stop. It followed me, moving from room to room. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, there were no notes, just silence. I almost convinced myself it was over. Then, at exactly noon, there was a knock at my door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I looked through the peephole but saw no one. My hand hovered over the lock. The knocks came again, louder this time. "Who's there?" I yelled. No answer. I decided not to open it. Instead, I slid a chair under the doorknob and went to my bedroom, shutting the door behind me. I stayed there for hours, clutching the knife under my pillow, every creak of the floorboards sending my heart racing. When I finally emerged, the note was waiting for me on the coffee table. It was longer than usual, and the handwriting was jagged, almost frantic. "You should have left when I told you. Now it's here." Before I could process it, the lights flickered and went out. The scratching started again, louder than ever, like something was clawing through the drywall. It wasn't just in one spot anymore. It was everywhere, above me, beneath me, surrounding me. I ran for the door, but the moment I reached it, the chair I'd wedged under the knob flew across the room as if it had been yanked by invisible hands. The door creaked open, just a crack, enough to see the darkness beyond it. And then I heard it, a voice, low and guttural, whispering my name. I don't remember what happened after that. I woke up on the floor the next morning, the apartment quiet again. The post-it notes were gone, every single one. The walls were pristine, no sign of the claw marks I swore I'd heard. The door was shut, locked, the chair back where I'd put it. For a week, nothing happened. No notes, no scratching, no strange voices. I started to believe it was over, that I was safe. But last night, I found a new note. Different paper this time. White, not yellow. The ink was red. It read, "Welcome back." I was folding laundry on a quiet Sunday afternoon when the phone buzzed. It wasn't an unusual sound, But when I glanced at the screen, my stomach dropped. It was a text from myself. Do not answer the door, no matter what. I stared at it for a long moment, the phone trembling slightly in my hand. My first instinct was to laugh it off, maybe even take a screenshot to share with friends. A glitch, some weird spam trick, right? But before I could react, another text came through. I mean it. They're already inside. I dropped the phone like it burned me. My pulse was hammering now, ears ringing as I glanced around the living room. Everything looked normal. The sunlight poured in through the sheer curtains. The sound of a distant lawnmower hummed in the background. Normal. But my chest tightened with the weight of the warning. I crept to the front door, every step careful and silent, and peered through the peephole. Nothing. The street was quiet. No sign of life save for a squirrel darting up a tree. Just as I was about to step back, a loud knock made me jump. 3 sharp raps. My heart seized, and I clapped a hand over my mouth to muffle the gasp. Another text buzzed. I told you not to answer. My hands were shaking as I backed away from the door. Who are you? I texted back, the words nearly incomprehensible with how clumsy my fingers were. The reply was instant. You already know. I wanted to throw the phone across the room, but another knock stopped me. Slower this time, deliberate, like whoever, or whatever, was out there knew I was hesitating. I glanced around the room, trying to calm the panic racing through my veins. The windows were locked. The back door was bolted. I was alone, wasn't I? I didn't have long to think about it because a voice called out from the other side of the door. Hey, it's me. Let me in. It sounded exactly like me. My voice, but wrong. There was no emotion, no inflection. Just words, hollow and mechanical. As if someone was trying to mimic me and hadn't quite figured out how human speech worked. The phone buzzed again. Do not speak to it. Do not let it in. You don't have much time. Sweat dripped down my temple as I typed out another reply. Who are you? How do you know this? The response chilled me to the bone. I'm you. The real you. And they're trying to replace us. A crashing sound from the kitchen sent me spinning around. My phone slipped from my hands and clattered to the floor, but I didn't dare pick it up. The kitchen, which had been silent moments ago, now emanated a faint scratching noise. It was like nails against tile, slow and deliberate. I inched closer, every muscle in my body screaming at me to turn and run. The scratching stopped, replaced by a soft, wet sound, like something being dragged. When I peeked around the corner, the room was empty. Nothing was out of place, except for one thing. The back door, which I was sure I had locked, was slightly ajar. The phone buzzed again from the floor behind me. I hesitated, but the need to see the message overpowered my fear. I snatched it up, nearly dropping it again when I saw the words on the screen. It's in. Do not look at it. The air in the room changed. It grew heavier, thicker, like I was wading through water. I turned slowly, dread pooling in my stomach, and froze. It was standing in the hallway. It looked like me. Every detail was perfect, the same messy hair, the same ratty sweatshirt I'd been wearing all day. But its face was wrong. Its features were too smooth, like a mannequin that had been half melted and reshaped. Its eyes were empty black voids, staring straight at me without blinking. I couldn't breathe. My phone vibrated again, but I couldn't look away from the thing. It cocked its head, mimicking my movements exactly, down to the shallow, shaky breaths I was struggling to take. Then it smiled. The phone buzzed louder, over and over, demanding my attention. Finally, with shaking hands, I glanced down. Do not smile back. Whatever you do, do not smile. But it was too late. My lips had already curled into a weak, involuntary grin, and the thing's smile widened impossibly, stretching across its face like it was splitting open. It lunged. I don't remember what happened next. When I woke up, I was lying on the kitchen floor, my phone clutched tightly in my hand. The back door was closed and locked. The house was quiet again, the sunlight streaming in like nothing had happened. But the phone buzzed one last time, and the message sent a shiver down my spine. They got you. Good luck. I don't know what it means. I feel the same, I think. I'm still me, aren't I? But sometimes, when I look in the mirror, my reflection holds its smile just a little too long. The rain started as a drizzle, harmless enough, but by the time I reached the edge of the old forest, it was a full-blown deluge. My jacket clung to me like a second skin, and my boots squelched with each step. The map in my hand was soaked, the ink running, but I knew the trail well enough by now. I wasn't here for sightseeing or fresh air. I was here because of the stories. Everyone in the village knew about the forest, and everyone knew to stay away. They told tales of disappearances, of people walking in and never walking out. But the strangest part? The forest didn't look sinister. There were no gnarled trees or ominous fog. It was just a dense, green expanse, the kind that seemed utterly indifferent to human presence. And yet, there was an itch in the back of my mind, a pull I couldn't explain. The whispers started just as I crossed the first stream. At first, I thought it was the rain or the wind, but the sounds didn't come and go like natural noises. They were persistent, threading through the air like ghostly threads. They didn't form words, not exactly, but they carried meaning. Keep going. I should have turned back, but curiosity is a stubborn beast. I pressed on, deeper into the woods, the path narrowing until it was little more than a suggestion between the trees. The rain began to let up, but the air grew colder, sharper. I wrapped my arms around myself, my breath visible in the dim light. And then, I saw it. A door. It stood alone in a clearing, unattached to any building or structure. Just a tall, wooden door painted a deep, glossy black. The handle was brass, polished to a gleam, and above it, etched into the wood, was a single word: choose. I circled the door, half expecting to find a trick, a hidden wall, a prank left by someone with too much time on their hands. But no matter where I stood, the door remained impossibly solitary, standing in defiance of logic. My heart thudded as I reached for the handle. The moment my fingers brushed the metal, the forest fell silent. No birds, no wind, not even the patter of rain on leaves. The stillness was so absolute that it made my ears ring. And then, as if responding to my hesitation, the whispers returned, louder now, more insistent. Open it. Against every instinct, I turned the handle and stepped through. The world on the other side was not what I expected. It wasn't a magical realm or a dystopian nightmare. It was a house, a sprawling, elegant mansion that seemed to go on forever. The floors were polished wood, the walls adorned with tapestries that depicted scenes both beautiful and grotesque. A chandelier hung above me, its crystals catching the faint light from an unseen source. "Welcome," a voice said. I spun around, but no one was there. The door had vanished behind me, replaced by an unbroken wall. The voice came again, smooth and precise. "You've been chosen. You must find your way." "Chosen for what?" I asked, my voice trembling. But there was no answer. Only the sound of footsteps, faint and deliberate, echoing from somewhere deep in the house. I moved cautiously, my steps soft against the floorboards. The air was thick with a strange scent, something metallic and sweet. The first room I entered was a library, the shelves lined with books whose titles I couldn't read. The letters shifted and danced, forming and reforming as I stared. One book lay open on a pedestal in the center of the room. Its pages were blank, but as I approached, words began to appear, written in a fluid, inky script. "What you seek lies ahead. What you fear follows close behind." I turned sharply, expecting to see someone, or something, but the room was empty. My pulse quickened as I left the library, stepping into a hallway that seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions. The house was a maze, each door leading to another room, each room stranger than the last. In one, a grand dining table was set with plates of food that shimmered unnaturally, as if lit from within. In another, a mirror showed not my reflection but a version of myself that was older, tired, and broken. And then there was the music room, where a piano played itself, the notes discordant and haunting. The whispers followed me everywhere, sometimes guiding, sometimes mocking. "Keep going. You're almost there." But almost where? And then, in a room filled with clocks that ticked in chaotic unison, I found it. A second door, smaller and painted white, with no handle. Above it, a plaque read, "One question must be answered before you pass." The whispers stilled, leaving a silence so profound it felt like the air had been sucked from the room. Then, a voice spoke. Not the one from before, but something older, deeper. "What are you willing to leave behind?" I hesitated, the weight of the question pressing down on me. What did it mean? My belongings? My memories? Myself? The house seemed to shift around me, the walls creaking as if impatient. Finally, I spoke. "Whatever it takes." The door opened. The world on the other side was blinding, a surge of light and sound that overwhelmed my senses. When it cleared, I was back in the forest, standing where the black door had been. Only now, the door was gone, and the forest was utterly silent. I made my way back to the village, my body heavy with exhaustion, but as I passed the first house, I realized something was wrong. No one recognized me. Faces that should have been familiar were blank with indifference. Even my own reflection in a shop window looked different. I wasn't the same, and neither was the world. The whispers had followed me back, faint but constant, a reminder of the choice I had made. And somewhere, deep in the forest, I knew the black door was waiting for someone else. A plain, brown cardboard box, unmarked except for my name and address scrawled in thick black marker. No return address. No postage. It was just sitting there on my front porch one evening when I came home from work. I live in the middle of nowhere. Woods on one side, a long stretch of empty road on the other. Deliveries don't just happen by accident out here. I nudged the box with my foot before picking it up. It wasn't heavy, but something inside shifted, like loose parts bumping against each other. Curiosity won over caution. I brought it inside, set it on the kitchen table, and grabbed a knife to slice it open. Inside was a handheld cassette recorder. Old, clunky, the kind they stopped making in the late 90s. Next to it was a single cassette tape, unlabeled, with nothing to indicate what might be on it. I stared at the setup for a while, half expecting a punchline, a prank, or maybe a hidden camera crew waiting to catch my reaction. But there was no one else. Just me, the box, and the tape. I wasn't scared, yet. Mostly confused. Who uses cassette tapes anymore? It felt almost quaint, like some lost relic of a simpler time. So, naturally, I popped the tape into the recorder, pressed play, and waited. At first, there was static. Soft, low, the kind of white noise that creeps into the background when a microphone is left on for too long. Then, faintly, I heard something. A voice. It was distorted, warped, as if the speaker was underwater. But I could make out enough words to feel my stomach tighten. "You shouldn't have opened it. You shouldn't have brought it inside." The tape clicked off. I sat there, staring at the recorder, trying to convince myself that what I'd heard wasn't as ominous as it sounded. Maybe it was a joke. Maybe someone at work was trying to mess with me. The rational explanations came easily at first, but they didn't last. Because when I tried to rewind the tape to listen again, the cassette wouldn't budge. The buttons locked up, like the machine had decided that once was enough. That's when the lights went out. Not just in my house, the whole neighborhood. The few other houses on my stretch of road, the streetlights, the faint glow of the distant highway. It all vanished in an instant. Just darkness, thick and oppressive, pressing in from all sides. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. Its beam cut through the blackness, jittery with the shaking of my hand. Somewhere outside, I heard a noise. A single, sharp snap, like a tree branch breaking. Then, silence. I told myself it was just the wind. A coincidence. But as I sat there in the dark, every instinct in my body screamed that I wasn't alone. That whatever had sent the package was out there, watching. The power came back a few minutes later, but by then, my nerves were shot. I didn't sleep that night. The recorder sat on the table, the tape inside mocking me with its stillness. By morning, I'd convinced myself to get rid of it. I drove out to the county dump and hurled the whole thing into a bin filled with broken appliances and rusted scraps of metal. I felt a strange mix of relief and guilt, as if I'd just thrown away a ticking time bomb that was never meant to be mine. For a week, nothing happened. Life went back to normal, and I almost managed to forget about the package. But then, last night, I heard the sound. It started around 2 a.m. A faint clicking, rhythmic and deliberate. like someone slowly pressing the buttons on an old cassette recorder. Click, click, click. It was coming from the living room. I got out of bed, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was empty, the table bare, but the sound continued. It was louder now, and closer. Click, click, click. I followed it into the hallway, then to the front door. The sound stopped as I reached for the handle. When I opened the door, the package was sitting there. Same size, same scrawled writing, same cassette recorder inside, except this time, there was a second tape next to the first. This one had a label, for later. I didn't listen to it. I didn't even touch it. I locked the door, shoved a chair against it, and spent the rest of the night curled up in the corner of my bedroom with a bat in my hands. This morning, the package was gone. I don't know what's happening. I don't know who sent it or why, but I can feel something closing in. The noises haven't stopped. Clicking, whispering, faint voices that sound like they're coming from a long, dark hallway just beyond the edge of my hearing. And now, as I'm writing this, there's a knock at the door. Not the polite kind. It's slow, deliberate, matching the same rhythm as the clicking. I think it's waiting for me to listen to the second tape. I don't want to. I'm afraid of what I might hear, but I'm more afraid of what will happen if I don't. It started with a photo. A single Polaroid slipped under my apartment door, face down on the hallway carpet. At first, I thought it was a mistake, a lost memento dropped by one of my neighbors. But when I picked it up and flipped it over, my stomach knotted. It was a picture of me, not just a random shot either. It was taken from inside my apartment. In the photo, I'm sitting at my desk, headphones on, staring at my computer screen. The angle was weird, low, almost like someone had crouched down behind my couch to take it. My desk light was on in the photo, casting a soft glow over the room. Here's the thing, though. My desk light had been off all morning. I opened the door and looked out into the hallway. It was empty. Quiet. Too quiet. I stood there for a few seconds, the Polaroid clenched in my hand, listening for footsteps or voices, but there was nothing. Just the faint hum of fluorescent lights. I slammed the door and locked it. Double-locked it, actually. Then I went through the whole apartment, checking every closet, every corner, every shadow. Nothing. No signs of anyone. I even checked the windows, but they were all locked from the inside. The photo had no writing, no date, no explanation. Just me, alone in my apartment, taken from a spot where no one should have been. I tried to shrug it off. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe someone broke in, took the photo, and left without stealing anything. But the thought didn't comfort me. It just made me more paranoid. I spent the rest of the day checking over my shoulder, convinced I was being watched. That night, I dreamed of the photo. In the dream, it wasn't just one picture. It was dozens, hundreds, all scattered across my floor. Each one was of me, taken at different times, from different angles, but always in my apartment. I could feel someone behind me, breathing, their shadow stretching across the wall as I tried to gather the photos. When I turned around, I woke up, drenched in sweat. The next morning, I found another Polaroid. This one was taped to the inside of my kitchen cabinet. It showed me in bed, asleep. My face was half buried in the pillow, the blanket tangled around my legs. I stared at it for a long time, my hands shaking. Someone had been in my apartment while I was sleeping. I called the building manager, demanding answers. He came up, checked the locks, and swore up and down that there was no way someone could have gotten in without a key. When I showed him the photos, his face went pale. "Are you sure you didn't take these yourself?" he asked, his voice hesitant, like he was trying not to spook me. Why would I take pictures of myself sleeping? I snapped. He didn't have an answer. He just gave me a strained smile and left, promising to look into it. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room with all the lights on, armed with a kitchen knife, staring at the door. Around 3 a.m., I heard it, a faint shuffling sound, like someone moving just outside the door. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I stood up, knife in hand, and crept toward the door. The sound stopped as soon as I got close. I held my breath, listening, but the hallway was silent. In the morning, there were 3 Polaroids on my coffee table. I hadn't heard anyone come in, hadn't seen anyone, but there they were. The first showed me sitting in the living room with the knife. The second showed me standing by the door, staring at it like a deer caught in headlights. The third showed the back of my head, as if someone had been standing right behind me. I left the apartment that day, packed a bag, called in sick to work, and checked into a cheap motel on the other side of town. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I just needed to get away, to figure out what was happening. For a few days, nothing happened. No photos, no weird noises, no feeling of being watched. I started to think it was over. Maybe whoever it was had gotten bored or moved on. But then, last night, I found a Polaroid under my motel room door. It showed me, sitting on the motel bed, staring at the door. The angle was the same as the first photo, low, like it had been taken from just inside the room. But the door was locked. I checked it myself, over and over. And now, as I'm writing this, I can feel it. Someone is here. I haven't turned around yet. I don't want to, but I can hear the faint whir of a camera. The first time I noticed something wrong, I was sitting at my desk at work. My boss, Karen, leaned over my cubicle wall to tell me about the team meeting, the one we have every Tuesday at 10 a.m. She smiled that tight-lipped Karen smile of hers and said, "Don't forget, the meeting starts at 9 today." 9? I repeated, "It's always at 10. She tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "It's always been at 9, Aaron." I laughed nervously, brushing it off as a mix-up. But when I checked my email later, the calendar invite clearly said 9 a.m. And the strangest thing? All the past invites had been updated too, as if the meeting had always been at 9. By itself, it was nothing, just a weird glitch. But that was only the beginning. Later that afternoon, I went to the break room to grab a coffee. There was a vending machine there, one I'd passed 100 times before, but it was different. Instead of snacks, it was filled with things like cufflinks, sewing needles, and a small jar labeled hair, assorted. "What the hell?" I muttered, staring at the machine. I thought maybe it was some kind of office prank, but when I mentioned it to Chloe from HR, she frowned. "What are you talking about? It's always been like that." Her tone made it clear she wasn't joking. The next day, the vending machine was gone entirely. That night, I went home feeling restless. I unlocked my apartment door and stepped inside, but something was off. It looked the same. Same beige couch, same crappy IKEA lamp, but it felt wrong, like someone had rearranged everything by a fraction of an inch. I shrugged it off, telling myself I was just imagining things. But when I opened the fridge, there was a plate of spaghetti sitting on the middle shelf. I don't cook spaghetti. I live alone. I threw it out and locked every door and window before going to bed. The next morning, I woke up with a faint, metallic taste in my mouth. My tongue felt sore, like I'd bitten it in my sleep. When I got to the bathroom, I froze. There was a tooth on the counter. Not my tooth. It was too large, yellowed and jagged, like it had come from an animal. But it was wet, fresh, like it had been ripped out moments before. I stared at it, trembling. That's when I noticed the sticky note taped to the bathroom mirror. In handwriting that wasn't mine, it read, "Don't." I called in sick to work that day. Over the next few weeks, reality started to unravel in ways I couldn't ignore. My favorite coffee shop changed its name overnight, from Perk and Brew to Cup and Handle. My phone's photo album had pictures of places I'd never been, with timestamps suggesting I'd taken them just days ago. Once, I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps, only to find my shoes caked in mud and leaves. Then people began to change. Karen stopped wearing her glasses, even though she used to squint at every PowerPoint slide. Chloe started calling me Eric instead of Aaron. When I corrected her, she just smiled and said, "I know." One afternoon, I ran into my neighbor, Mrs. Grayson, in the hallway. I greeted her, but she just stared at me. Her face was blank, her mouth slightly open. Then she said, "I liked you better the other way." "What does that mean?" I asked, my voice rising, but she just smiled and shuffled away, dragging her slippers against the carpet. That night, I dreamed about the spaghetti. In the dream, I was sitting at my kitchen table, eating it with my hands. The sauce dripped down my chin, and I couldn't stop shoving it into my mouth, even when it started tasting sour, like spoiled milk. When I woke up, my hands were sticky. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough. I packed a bag and called a cab to take me to the train station. I didn't know where I was going, but anywhere was better than staying here. The cab driver didn't say a word the whole ride. When we pulled up to the station, I handed him some cash and stepped out. But before I could walk away, he rolled down the window and said, "It won't work, you know." I froze. He grinned, his teeth yellow and sharp. "You can't run from this." When I turned back to the train station, it wasn't there. The entire building had vanished, replaced by an empty field of dead grass. I didn't go home that night. I wandered the streets, desperate to stay in public spaces around people. But even the people felt wrong now. Their eyes lingered too long. Their movements were slightly jerky, like puppets on strings. Eventually, I found myself back at my apartment. The door was open. Inside, every piece of furniture was gone. The walls were bare, the floor stripped down to the concrete. Except for one thing, the plate of spaghetti sitting in the middle of the room. There was a fork next to it this time, and another sticky note. "Eat." I haven't left the apartment since. I don't know what's real anymore. The vending machine, the tooth, the dream. I can't tell if they're connected, or if I'm losing my mind. The spaghetti plate is still there, untouched. It's been 3 days. The smell is unbearable, sour and sweet at the same time. And sometimes I think I see it move, the noodles shifting like something's writhing underneath them. There's a new note on the fridge. It says, "Time's running out." I think it's right. I tossed a bowl of soup inside, like always, punched in 2 minutes, and wandered off to scroll through my phone while it heated up. A few seconds later, I heard the ding. Not the half-hearted whir of it spinning lazily, or the popping sound when soup bubbles over. The actual ding. Like the microwave had already finished. I frowned. 2 minutes hadn't passed. It hadn't even been 20 seconds. When I opened the door, the soup was steaming hot, bubbles still breaking the surface like it had been boiling for hours. I pulled the bowl out cautiously, checked the time on the microwave's display, and felt a shiver crawl up my spine. The display wasn't showing numbers anymore. Just a single word. Done. I laughed it off, nervous, shaky, but that word lingered in my head. Done. Done with what? By the time I sat down to eat, the soup was lukewarm. I didn't finish it. The microwave wasn't the only thing. Little changes began creeping into my life, subtle enough that anyone else would have ignored them. But once you notice one, you start noticing them all. My apartment was the same, except it wasn't. The coffee table was an inch to the left one morning. The next day, my bookshelf had an extra row of books I didn't own. I'd find my shoes arranged neatly by the door even though I always left them scattered in the hallway. One night, I came home to the faint smell of lavender, like someone had sprayed air freshener, but I didn't own any lavender-scented anything. And then there was the shadow. It first appeared as I was brushing my teeth, a flicker in the corner of the bathroom mirror. I glanced behind me, expecting a fly or maybe a smudge on the glass, but nothing was there. When I turned back to the mirror, the shadow had moved. Closer now, behind my shoulder, featureless and dark. "Get it together," I muttered, rinsing my mouth. The shadow didn't move. By the next morning, it was gone, and for a while, I convinced myself it had just been a trick of the light. But it kept coming back. In windows, in reflections, in the shimmer of my computer screen when it was powered off. Never doing anything, just watching. I started keeping notes. Dates, times, places. I sketched what I saw, patterns in the shadow, shapes in the glitches. But the more I wrote, the more things stopped making sense. Days blurred together. Events happened in the wrong order. Once, I was writing an entry about my lunch break when I looked down and realized my hand was holding a pen I didn't own. A sleek black pen with no branding, no markings. When I tried to throw it away, it showed up again in my desk drawer the next morning. Then there was my neighbor, Tim. Tim was one of those friendly but distant types, the kind of guy who waves in the hallway but doesn't stop to chat. I liked it that way. Small talk exhausts me. But one day, Tim knocked on my door. When I opened it, his face was blank, expressionless. He didn't say a word. Hey Tim, I ventured. "What's up?" He tilted his head, bird-like. "Do you remember?" he asked, his voice flat, monotone. "Remember what?" But Tim didn't answer. He just stood there, staring, until I closed the door on him. I listened for his footsteps, for the creak of him walking away, but there was only silence. When I checked through the peephole, the hallway was empty. The next morning, the apartment next to mine was vacant. Tim's nameplate was gone. His door looked like it hadn't been touched in years, dust clinging to the edges. Things escalated after that. Time stopped behaving itself. One evening, I walked to the kitchen to make dinner, and when I looked at the clock, it was 2 a.m. The sky outside was still dark, and I couldn't remember what had happened between 7 p.m. and now. Other times, I'd lose chunks of time entirely. I'd blink and find myself in a different room, holding objects I didn't remember picking up. I woke up one morning to find my entire apartment rearranged. Furniture flipped, walls painted a pale gray I didn't recognize. Who's doing this? I shouted at no one. My voice echoed back, flat and distant. One night, I dreamt I was standing in a white void, an endless expanse of nothing. A figure approached me, featureless, humanoid, made entirely of static. Its voice was a crackle, impossible to place. "You're awake," it said. "I'm dreaming," I countered. "Not anymore." I woke up in my bed, sweat soaking the sheets. My clock read 3:12 a.m., but I didn't trust it. The air felt heavy, like the world was waiting for me to make a move. The final straw came a week later. I walked into my apartment after work, threw my bag onto the couch, and stopped. There was someone sitting at my kitchen table. It was me. Not a twin, not a doppelganger. Me. Same hair, same clothes, same tired eyes. They were sitting there, calmly drinking a cup of tea like they belonged. "What the?" I started, but the other me raised a hand to silence me. "Don't panic," they said. Their voice was my voice, but sharper, like it had been tuned to a higher frequency. "What are you?" I demanded. "I'm the part of you that remembers," they said simply. "Remembers what?" Their smile was thin, humorless. "Everything." Before I could respond, they stood, walked past me, and vanished through the front door. When I looked outside, the hallway was gone. In its place was that endless white void from my dream. I haven't seen them since, but I feel their presence every time I turn around too quickly or catch movement in the corner of my eye. The glitches are constant now. Voices whispering in the vents, objects disappearing only to reappear days later. And the shadow? It doesn't hide anymore. It stands in the corner of my room every night, silent and waiting. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever leave this place. Sometimes I wonder if I ever really existed at all. It began with a missing cat flyer. I found it taped to the lamppost outside my apartment building one morning. The photo was grainy, but the details were clear. A fluffy gray tabby with striking green eyes. "Missing, Daisy," it read, followed by a phone number and a plea for any information. I remember thinking how sad it was. I'd seen the cat lounging in a nearby window a few times. It must have slipped out. That evening, as I returned from work, I saw a man standing near the same lamppost. He wasn't taping anything new, just standing there, staring at the flyer. He had this slightly disheveled look, unkempt hair, worn sneakers, and a jacket that was too thin for the weather. Something about him felt off. Not dangerous, just unsettling. I slowed down as I passed, and he turned to look at me. His face was blank, but his eyes were sharp, too sharp, like they saw more than they should. "Do you know Daisy?" he asked, his voice low and hoarse. Caught off guard, I stammered. No. I've seen her in the window, though. She's cute." He tilted his head, studying me, and for a moment, I thought he was going to say something else, but he didn't. He just gave a short nod and walked away, leaving me standing there with a strange weight in my chest. The next day, the flyer was gone. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe the owner had found Daisy. I told myself it was a good thing. But that night, as I stepped out to take my trash to the curb, I found another flyer taped to the dumpster. Only this one didn't have a picture of Daisy. It was blank except for 3 words scrawled in thick black marker. "Do you know?" It sent a chill down my spine. I looked around, but the alley was empty, the dumpsters silent sentinels in the dim glow of the streetlights. I tore the flyer down and hurried back inside, telling myself it was a coincidence. Some prank, maybe, but it didn't stop. The next morning, there was another flyer on my mailbox. This one had the same question, "Do you know?" But below it was a blurry image of a figure standing on a sidewalk. It was too grainy to make out details, but something about the posture, the shape of the figure, felt eerily familiar. I ripped that one down too, stuffing it into my bag and trying to ignore the way my hands shook. But as the days went on, the flyers kept appearing. On my car windshield, slipped under my apartment door, folded neatly and left on my desk at work. Always the same question, always accompanied by a distorted image of the same figure, getting closer each time. I tried to explain it away. Maybe someone had me confused with someone else. Maybe it was a weird guerrilla marketing campaign. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that. I could feel the weight of it, the deliberate intent. Whoever was doing this wasn't making a mistake. They meant for me to see. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment. I lived alone, and the building was usually quiet after dark. The footsteps were slow, almost hesitant, like someone pacing. I held my breath, listening. Then came the sound of something sliding under my door. I crept out of bed, my heart pounding, and flipped on the light. There, lying on the floor, was another flyer. This one didn't have the question, just a photo of my apartment door, taken from the hallway. I called the police the next morning. They took a report but didn't seem too concerned. "Probably just a prank," the officer said, though his expression was uneasy. "Let us know if it escalates." That night, I installed a security camera outside my door. It didn't make me feel any safer. The footage was normal for the first few nights. Neighbors coming and going, the occasional delivery driver. But then, around 3 a.m. on a Wednesday, the camera caught something. A figure in a hooded jacket, standing at the far end of the hallway. Just standing there, perfectly still, facing my door. They didn't approach, didn't move for nearly 5 minutes. Then they turned and walked away, disappearing down the stairwell. I took the footage to the police, but they said the image was too blurry to identify the person. "We'll keep an eye out," they promised. It didn't feel like enough. The flyers stopped for a while after that. Weeks passed without incident, and I started to believe it was over. But the unease never fully left me. I still felt like I was being watched, even in the most ordinary moments. Waiting at the crosswalk, picking up groceries, sitting in my living room. And then, last night, I found something new. I'd gone to bed early, trying to shake off the exhaustion that had clung to me all week. Around 2 a.m., I woke up suddenly, as though pulled from sleep by some unseen force. The apartment was silent. Too silent. That's when I noticed the smell. A faint, metallic tang in the air, sharp and wrong. I got up, my legs shaky, and followed the scent to the living room. There, on my coffee table, was a small metal object, a key. It wasn't mine. Attached to it was a note, folded neatly in half. I opened it with trembling hands, expecting another cryptic message. But this time, it was different. It was a single sentence, written in small, precise letters. "Daisy is waiting. I haven't left my apartment since. I don't know what the key is for, and I don't want to find out. But I can't shake the feeling that whatever this is, it's far from over. And I can't help but wonder, was this ever about Daisy at all?" I work as a freelance photographer. It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills. Most of my jobs are pretty straightforward. Weddings, portraits, the occasional corporate gig. But last month, I got an unusual request that I haven't been able to shake. A man named Peter contacted me through my website. He introduced himself as the executor of an estate and explained that he needed high-quality photos of a property before it went up for sale. He was oddly specific about the timing, insisting I shoot it at dusk, and offered to pay double my usual rate. I agreed without much thought. Money's money. The house was about an hour outside the city, surrounded by dense woods. When I arrived, the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. No birds, no wind, just an eerie, oppressive stillness. The house itself was enormous, an old Victorian with peeling paint and a sagging roofline. It felt wrong somehow, like it had been left to rot in the middle of nowhere. Peter met me on the porch. He was a short man with a nervous energy, his eyes darting around like he was waiting for something to jump out of the shadows. "Thanks for coming," he said, his voice low. "I need this done quickly. Just get some wide shots, a few of the main rooms, and, if you can, the basement." "The basement?" I repeated. That was a first. "Yeah," he said, not meeting my eyes. "It's part of the house. Weird, but not the weirdest request I've ever had." I nodded and got to work. The inside of the house was worse than the outside. The air was damp and heavy, and the walls were stained with years of neglect. Furniture was scattered randomly, covered in sheets that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. I started in the foyer, snapping wide shots of the staircase and high ceilings. The light was fading fast, casting long shadows that made the place feel even more claustrophobic. As I moved from room to room, I noticed something odd. Every mirror in the house was either shattered or missing. The frames were still there, but the glass had been removed or smashed to pieces. I tried to ignore it and focus on the job. The kitchen was a disaster. Rusted appliances, broken tiles, water damage creeping up the walls. In one corner, there was a door that led to the basement. It was slightly ajar, and something about the darkness beyond it made my skin crawl. I decided to save the basement for last. As I moved upstairs, the air seemed to get heavier. The second floor was a maze of small rooms, most of them empty. In one, I found a child's bed frame with a single, tattered sheet draped over it. A faint smell of mildew hung in the air, mixed with something sharper, like iron. I took a few shots and was about to leave when I heard a faint creak behind me. I turned, expecting to see Peter, but the hallway was empty. The door to the room I just photographed was now slightly closed. I stared at it for a moment, heart racing, then shook it off. Old houses make noise. Doors shift. It's nothing. But when I turned back to the bed frame, the sheet was on the floor. I left the room in a hurry, blaming the wind or gravity, or any explanation that didn't involve what my gut was screaming at me. As I stepped into the hallway, I heard another sound, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the end of the corridor. Against my better judgment, I followed it. The tapping led me to a small door I hadn't noticed before, tucked into the corner of the hallway. It was low, almost like it was made for a child. The sound stopped the moment I touched the doorknob. Inside was a small, dark room, completely bare except for a single, ancient rocking chair. It was tilted slightly forward, as if someone had just stood up from it. I backed out, closed the door, and didn't look back. The basement was the last stop. I made my way down the creaking stairs, the air growing colder with every step. My flashlight barely cut through the darkness, illuminating stone walls slick with moisture. The smell down here was worse, a mix of earth and decay that made me gag. At the far end of the basement was another door, this one heavy and made of iron. It was covered in scratches, deep gouges that crisscrossed the surface like something, or someone, had been clawing at it. I took a single photo, the flash momentarily lighting up the room. In that split second, I thought I saw movement behind the door, a shadow that wasn't mine. That was enough for me. I practically ran back up the stairs, my heart pounding. Peter was waiting in the foyer, his expression tense. "Did you get it all?" he asked, his voice shaky. "Yeah," I said, barely able to catch my breath. "I got what I needed." He nodded, avoiding my eyes. "Good. You should leave now." I didn't need to be told twice. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The woods seemed darker than before, the trees pressing in on either side of the road. When I got home, I immediately uploaded the photos, desperate to distract myself with the mundane task of editing. That's when I saw it. In nearly every photo, there was something in the background. A figure, faint and indistinct, standing just at the edge of the frame. It was in the kitchen, the upstairs hallway, even the rocking chair room. Always the same, too tall, too thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. And in the photo of the basement door, the shadow behind the iron was clearer now. A hand, impossibly long and skeletal, pressed against the crack, as if it were trying to push through. I closed my laptop and deleted the files. That night, I dreamed of the house. I was back in the hallway, standing in front of the small door with the rocking chair inside. This time, it was open, and the chair was moving, slowly, back and forth. I haven't taken another job since, but sometimes, when I'm alone, I hear the faint sound of tapping, and I know it's not over. The convenience store sat on the edge of a quiet highway, its flickering neon sign visible from miles away in the dark. I pulled in late, too tired from the road to care about the place's rundown appearance. I just needed gas, maybe a snack, and some caffeine to keep me going until I reached the next town. Inside, the store felt oddly timeless. The shelves were crammed with snacks I hadn't seen since I was a kid. Neon worms, Zap, Cola, and those old triangle-shaped Dorito bags from the 90s. Even the music playing over the crackly speakers was a faintly familiar tune I couldn't quite place, like something I'd heard in the background of a childhood memory. The clerk didn't look up when I entered. He was a gaunt man in his 60s, with deeply set eyes and an unsettling stillness. He sat behind the counter, staring at a TV mounted on the wall that only displayed static. The room smelled faintly of burnt plastic. I wandered the aisles, feeling like I'd stepped into a snapshot of the past. I picked up a bottle of water and a candy bar, and as I headed to the counter, I noticed something strange. The gas pumps outside were different. When I'd pulled in, they'd been the modern kind, with card readers and digital screens. Now, they were old-fashioned, with spinning dials and weathered paint. I shook my head, convinced I was imagining things. The clerk finally turned his gaze toward me as I placed my items on the counter. His eyes were milky, like someone who'd stared at the sun for too long. He scanned the candy bar with an old, clunky machine that beeped in a way I hadn't heard in years. "Long drive?" he asked, his voice gravelly. "Yeah," I said, pulling out my card to pay. The terminal looked ancient, with faded buttons and a scratched-up screen. "This place is kind of retro." His lips curled into a faint smile, but he didn't respond. I slid my card into the reader, but it didn't work. He pointed to a small sign taped to the counter. "Cash only." Of course. I dug into my wallet and handed him a 20. He counted out my change with deliberate slowness, the coins clicking loudly against the counter. As I turned to leave, he spoke again. "You should be careful out there. Roads get strange this time of night." I nodded politely, but his words stayed with me as I stepped outside. The gas station looked wrong. The flickering neon sign now read, "Raise, Fill and Go," but when I'd arrived, I was certain it had said, "Highway Mart." Even the car parked at the far end of the lot, a rusted old station wagon, hadn't been there before. I shook off the unease and started pumping gas. The handle felt heavier than it should have, and the gas smelled acrid, like it had been sitting too long. My car seemed to take forever to fill up, and when I finally looked at the pump, the price was listed in cents, not dollars, 33.7 cents per gallon. I froze. That couldn't be right. I glanced back at the store, but the windows were now dark. The clerk was gone. I decided I'd had enough. I threw the pump back onto its cradle and jumped into my car. As I drove off, the uneasy feeling grew stronger. The highway looked different, the trees taller and denser than I remembered. The road signs were older, with peeling paint and unfamiliar names. I hadn't noticed any of this on my way in. My phone had no signal, so I turned on the radio. Static. Every station. I flipped through, desperate for some connection to the outside world, until I landed on a faint, warbling tune. It was the same song I'd heard in the convenience store, but slower, distorted. The lyrics were garbled, as if the singer's voice was being pulled apart. That's when I saw it. A figure, standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop just feet from them. It was a woman, her hair wild and her dress torn, as if she'd been running through the woods. She didn't move, didn't even flinch at the headlights glaring into her face. I rolled down my window a crack. "Hey, are you okay?" She tilted her head, her face pale and empty, like a mannequin's. Then she smiled, wide and unnatural, her teeth too white in the darkness. I put the car in reverse, my heart racing, but as I looked in the rearview mirror, she was already standing behind the car. She tapped on the trunk, her smile unwavering. "You forgot something." My chest tightened. I floored it, swerving around her and speeding down the highway. When I glanced in the rearview again, she was gone. The road stretched endlessly ahead. the trees on either side closing in. I drove for what felt like hours, but I never saw another car, never passed another exit. Just mile after mile of the same unchanging scenery. The gas gauge dropped faster than it should have, and soon the engine sputtered and died, leaving me stranded in the middle of nowhere. I grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out into the eerie silence. The air was heavy, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears. I started walking, hoping to find help, but the road seemed to loop back on itself. No matter how far I walked, I ended up back where I started. The convenience store was there, sitting in the middle of the road. Its neon sign buzzed faintly, now reading "Simply Open." The pumps gleamed in the moonlight, the old-fashioned dials spinning slowly, though no one was using them. The door creaked open on its own as I approached, and the smell of burnt plastic wafted out to greet me. Inside, everything was exactly as it had been. The outdated snacks, the Zap, cola, the static on the TV. Except now, the clerk wasn't behind the counter. He was standing in the corner, his milky eyes locked on me. Beside him was the woman from the road, her too wide smile frozen in place. She raised a hand and pointed to the shelf behind me. Slowly, I turned. There, among the candy bars and gum, was a photograph. It was old and faded, but I recognized the person in it immediately. It was me, and in the background, just barely visible, was the convenience store. The photo slid off the shelf and into my hands, though I hadn't touched it. The clerk's voice broke the silence. "Welcome back." The door slammed shut. The lights flickered, and the song on the radio started playing again, louder this time, with words I could finally understand. "You're already home." I woke up to static, a low hiss that filled the room like it was alive. My alarm clock radio always played the same morning talk show, the hosts laughing too loudly and bickering about politics. But that morning, it was just static. I hit the snooze button, but it didn't stop. Even unplugging it didn't make a difference. The static continued, faint and buzzing, as if it were coming from the walls themselves. I shoved the clock into the closet and tried to forget about it. The second strange thing was the coffee shop. I go there every day, enough that the barista knows my name and my order without asking. Black coffee, no sugar, no cream. But when I walked in, the place was empty. No line, no customers, no barista. The air was thick with the smell of burnt coffee, and the machines behind the counter whirred softly, even though no one was operating them. I called out a hesitant, "Hello," and a voice answered from the back, sharp and unfamiliar. "Just a moment." The barista who emerged wasn't Mark, the guy who'd been making my coffee for years. It was a woman with a face that didn't quite fit. Her features were mismatched, eyes too close together, a mouth too wide, and her smile stretched too far across her cheeks. "Black coffee, no sugar, no cream," she said, her voice a little too bright. She handed me the cup before I could respond. I didn't drink it. By the time I got to work, the static was in my head. Not just the memory of it, but an actual faint buzzing, as though my skull had become an antenna picking up some distant signal. I asked Daniel if he heard it too. He just stared at me for a long moment, then said, "You look tired, Steve." My name isn't Steve. When I corrected him, he blinked like I'd spoken a language he didn't understand. "Sure," he said finally, and turned back to his computer. The third strange thing was the hallway. On my way to the bathroom, I passed a door I didn't recognize. It wasn't new. Its paint was chipped, its brass handle tarnished, like it had been there for years. But I knew it hadn't been there yesterday. I tried the handle. Locked. When I pressed my ear against the door, I heard something on the other side. A low murmur, like voices just out of reach, or the sound of wind rushing through a narrow tunnel. It made my chest tighten. When I asked Carla, my boss, about the door, she frowned. "What door?" "The one by the copy room," I said, feeling stupid even as the words left my mouth. She stared at me for a moment, then laughed nervously. "Maybe you need a vacation." By the end of the week, the world felt wrong. It wasn't just the static or the strange barista or the door that shouldn't exist. It was everything. My apartment seemed bigger than it used to be. The ceilings a little higher, the corners a little sharper. The streetlights on my block cast shadows that didn't match their surroundings. And the people, My neighbors, my coworkers, even strangers on the street, moved like actors in a poorly rehearsed play. They smiled too easily, laughed too loudly, their movements just a fraction too smooth. I started avoiding them. When the buzzing in my head got worse, I stopped going to work entirely. I stayed in my apartment, curtains drawn, doors locked. The static was everywhere now, not just in my head but in the walls, the floors, the air itself. It grew louder at night, rising to a crescendo that left me shaking under my blankets. One night, I woke up to find my bedroom door open. I always kept it closed, but now it was ajar, the darkness of the hallway spilling into the room like ink. I stared at it for what felt like hours, too afraid to move, until I finally worked up the courage to get out of bed. The hallway was empty. The door to my apartment was still locked, the chain in place. But when I turned to go back to my room, I saw it. The new door. It was in the hallway now, where there had been nothing but a blank wall before. The same chipped paint, the same tarnished brass handle. This time, the door was open, just a crack, and from the darkness beyond it came the faintest sound. A voice. My voice. I didn't move. I couldn't. Then the door opened wider. The light in the hallway flickered, and for a brief moment, I saw what was on the other side. It wasn't another room, or even another place. It was me, standing there, in the same clothes I was wearing, staring back at me with wide, unblinking eyes. And then it smiled. I slammed the door shut and locked it, then pushed a heavy bookshelf in front of it for good measure. But the static didn't stop. If anything, it grew louder, filling the apartment until I couldn't hear my own thoughts. I crouched in the corner of the living room, clutching my head, and screamed for it to stop. When I opened my eyes, it was morning. The door was gone. The hallway was empty, just like it had always been. For a moment, I thought it might have been a dream, but then I saw the scratch marks on the floor where I dragged the bookshelf. I haven't left the apartment since. The static is quieter now, but I know it's still there, waiting, just below the surface. Sometimes, when the light is just right, I can see faint outlines on the walls, like the edges of a door trying to press through. And at night, when the static gets louder, I hear my voice again, calling to me from somewhere far away. "We miss you," it says. "Please come back." Just a single, muffled chuckle that drifted into my kitchen while I was washing dishes late one evening. I froze, hands submerged in soapy water, straining to listen. My apartment was quiet. The TV was off, my phone was in the other room, and I lived alone. The sound didn't come again, and I convinced myself it had been my imagination. Or maybe a neighbor's TV bleeding through the walls. That seemed plausible enough. Still, as I turned off the faucet and wiped my hands, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder. The next time it happened, I was brushing my teeth. It wasn't a laugh this time, but a sharp tap against my bathroom mirror, like someone flicking it with their finger. My eyes shot up to my reflection, but of course, no one was there. Just my own wide-eyed face staring back at me. I leaned closer to the mirror, examining it like it might reveal something, but it was just glass. Perfectly normal, perfectly ordinary. I went to bed that night with my heart pounding and every light in the apartment left on. The noises became more frequent after that. A faint humming while I folded laundry. Footsteps in the hallway when I was showering. Once, I even heard the sound of someone exhaling, right behind me, when I was in my living room. Every time, I checked. Every time, I found nothing. It was like the air itself had become alive with a presence that stayed just out of sight. Then, things started moving. It began subtly. A mug left on the counter would appear in the sink. My keys, which I always kept in the dish by the door, would show up on the coffee table. One night, I came home from work to find my bedroom window wide open. I never opened it. It was January, and the freezing air stung as I rushed to close it. I told myself I was being forgetful, distracted, maybe stressed, but deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The first time I saw them, I was lying in bed, half asleep. It was around 2 a.m., and I woke up with the inexplicable feeling of being watched. My room was dark, but the faint glow of a street lamp outside cast just enough light to see by. At first, I thought the shadows at the foot of my bed were just that, shadows. Then one of them moved. It was quick, just a small twitch, but enough to make my breath catch. The shape was tall and thin, its edges blurry, like smoke caught in a jar. My body locked up in fear, and for what felt like hours, I didn't move, didn't even blink. I just stared at the figure, and it stared back. When I finally mustered the courage to reach for my phone on the nightstand, the shape vanished. Just gone, like it had never been there. I started sleeping with the lights on after that. Not that it helped. The figure didn't always appear, but when it did, it got bolder, closer. Once, I woke up to find it crouched beside my bed, its head tilted as if studying me. Another time, I saw it standing in the corner of the kitchen while I ate breakfast. Each time, it dissolved into nothing as soon as I moved. I tried everything. Salt lines by the doors and windows, sage, even a cheap online cleansing kit that promised to banish spirits for good. Nothing worked. The figure wasn't just haunting my apartment, it was haunting me. One night, I decided to confront it. I'd had enough of the sleepless nights, the constant unease, the feeling that I was losing my mind. Armed with a flashlight and my phone's camera, I sat in the middle of the living room, waiting. It didn't take long. Around midnight, the air grew heavy, the kind of oppressive stillness that presses against your chest. Then, there it was, materializing in the doorway like a trick of the light. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice shaking but loud enough to echo. The figure didn't respond. It never did. But this time, it didn't vanish either. Instead, it moved closer, slow and deliberate, until it was only a few feet away. Up close, I could see it more clearly, or rather, I could see the lack of it. It wasn't a person or even a thing. It was an absence, a hollow void that seemed to drink in the light around it. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then, it raised a hand, or what might have been a hand, and pointed, not at me, but at the floor by my feet. I looked down, and my stomach dropped. There was something there, something I hadn't noticed before. A trapdoor, barely visible, its edges worn and splintered. I'd lived in that apartment for 3 years and never seen it before. My first instinct was to ignore it, pretend it wasn't there, but the figure didn't move. It just kept pointing, insistent. With trembling hands, I knelt and pried the trapdoor open. The smell hit me first, damp and earthy, like a basement that had been left to rot. Below was a narrow tunnel, its walls lined with brick and stretching into darkness. When I looked back up, the figure was gone. I don't know what possessed me to climb down. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was desperation. Maybe I thought that if I did what it wanted, it would leave me alone. I grabbed a flashlight and descended the ladder, my heart pounding with every step. The tunnel was cold and silent, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. As I moved forward, I noticed something carved into the walls. Symbols I didn't recognize, crude and jagged, like they'd been scratched in haste. Then I heard it, the laugh, the same muffled chuckle that had started this whole nightmare. Only now it was louder, echoing off the walls. I froze. Ahead, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber, and in the faint beam of my flashlight, I saw something. I don't have the words to describe it. A mass of shifting shadows and glinting eyes, too many eyes, all fixed on me. It didn't move, didn't make a sound beyond that awful laugh. But I knew, deep in my gut, that I wasn't supposed to be there. I turned and ran, scrambling up the ladder and slamming the trapdoor shut behind me. The figure hasn't appeared since that night, but I can still feel its presence, lingering at the edges of my life. And sometimes, when it's quiet, I swear I can hear that laugh, soft and distant, like it's waiting for me to come back. The day started with the smell of roses, which was odd because I didn't own any. My apartment smelled perpetually like coffee and faint laundry detergent, not the heady, intoxicating scent of fresh roses. At first, I thought it might be coming from outside. Maybe someone on the floor below was wearing perfume, but the scent was everywhere. It lingered in my closet, clung to my bedsheets, and even rose from the pages of the novel I'd left on my nightstand. I brushed it off as a weird olfactory quirk, a momentary blip in my otherwise mundane morning. But when I stepped into the kitchen, I noticed the mug on the counter wasn't mine. It was a delicate thing, bone white with gold trim, painted with tiny red flowers. I didn't own anything like it. My mugs were practical, ceramic, and chipped from years of use. This one looked antique, something you'd find in an old lady's china cabinet. I picked it up, half expecting it to vanish like a mirage, but it was real. The inside of the mug was damp, as though someone had recently drunk tea from it. A faint ring of red lipstick circled the rim. My breath caught, and I looked around, heart racing. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. The apartment was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. I set the mug down carefully and grabbed my phone. Maybe I'd been robbed, though that didn't make sense. Who breaks into an apartment to leave teacups? The lock on my door was still bolted, and the windows were shut tight. I tapped out a text to my landlord, asking if anyone had been in the unit for maintenance, but deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I forced myself to carry on with the day, chalking it up to sleep deprivation or an overactive imagination. I had meetings to attend, emails to answer, and no time to unravel mysteries about rogue teacups. But as the hours wore on, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. At noon, my computer froze mid-email. The screen flickered, and for a split second, it wasn't my inbox staring back at me. It was a reflection of my apartment. Not my desktop wallpaper, not the window behind me, but the living room itself, the couch and coffee table bathed in a pale, moonlit glow. A figure stood in the corner, barely more than a shadow. I blinked, and the screen went black. "Okay," I whispered, pushing away from the desk. My pulse was thundering in my ears. Maybe I was losing it. Maybe this was a fever dream brought on by too much caffeine and not enough sleep. I needed fresh air. I left the apartment, heading for the park nearby. The streets were crowded with the usual midday rush, but something felt off. The people around me moved in strange patterns, their steps synchronized like dancers in an invisible performance. A man in a dark coat walked past me, brushing my shoulder. I turned to apologize, but he was already gone, swallowed by the crowd. At the park, the air was thick with the same rose scent that had clung to my apartment. I found a bench and sat down, letting my head fall into my hands. I needed to ground myself, maybe call a friend, or just talk to someone to remind myself the world was still normal. When I looked up, there was a letter on the bench beside me. Cream-colored, heavy paper, folded neatly with my name written in elegant cursive on the front. My breath hitched. I hadn't seen anyone approach. The bench had been empty a moment ago. I unfolded the letter with trembling hands. The words inside were written in the same cursive. "You're not supposed to be here." My stomach twisted. The words were vague but heavy, laced with a weight I couldn't explain. I turned the paper over, looking for more, but the rest of the page was blank. I stuffed it into my pocket and bolted for home. When I got back to my apartment, the mug was gone. In its place was a rose. Fresh, crimson, and so fragrant it almost made my head spin. It sat on the counter, a single drop of water trailing down the stem like a tear. My hands were shaking as I picked it up. The petals were impossibly soft, but there was something odd about the flower. Beneath the crimson exterior, faint patterns were etched into the petals, lines and symbols that almost looked like words. I turned on the lights, holding the rose under the lamp. The symbols became clearer, intricate, and deliberate. They didn't belong to any language I knew, but they pulsed faintly, as though alive. I dropped the rose onto the counter and stumbled back. The lights flickered, and then I heard it, footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway outside my apartment. I froze, my pulse hammering in my chest. The steps stopped just outside my door. There was a soft knock, 3 sharp raps that echoed through the room. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My legs felt like lead. The door creaked open. No one was there. But the air was colder now, and the scent of roses was overwhelming. It was suffocating, curling into my lungs and squeezing the breath out of me. The door slammed shut on its own, and the lights went out completely. I was alone in the dark, but I could feel it. Something was in the room with me. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I fumbled for it, desperate for any source of light. The screen lit up with a notification. A text from an unknown number. "You're not supposed to see this." The rose on the counter began to glow faintly, the symbols on its petals shifting and rearranging themselves. They coalesced into a single word: run. I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my keys and bolted out of the apartment, not bothering to lock the door. The hallway was dark, eerily quiet, as though the entire building had emptied itself of life. I ran down the stairs and into the street, the cold night air a welcome shock against my skin. When I looked back at the building, my window was dark, but someone, or something, was standing in it, watching me. I couldn't make out their face, but I could feel their gaze, heavy and unrelenting. I haven't gone back since. Every now and then, I catch a whiff of roses, faint and fleeting. I don't know what it means, but I know one thing for certain. Wherever I am, I don't think I'm supposed to be here. I first met Clara in the waiting room of my therapist's office. I wasn't there for anything serious, just the usual existential dread. But Clara? She looked like she carried the weight of the world on her shoulders. Her red scarf was loose around her neck, her coat a little too big, her eyes darting to the corners of the room like she expected something to jump out at her. "You here for Dr. Fry?" I asked, trying to make conversation. She nodded but didn't respond. Her hands clutched a notebook so tightly I thought she might crush it. The cover was dark blue, the edges worn, as though it had been through hell and back. When the receptionist called my name, Clara grabbed my wrist as I stood. Her grip was cold, clammy. "Don't trust the gaps," she whispered. I blinked at her, confused. The what? But before I could ask, she let go and turned her attention back to the floor. I stared at her for a moment longer before heading into my session. By the time I came out, she was gone. I couldn't stop thinking about what she'd said. Don't trust the gaps. It was such a strange thing to say, so specific and vague at the same time. I chalked it up to her having her own issues and left it at that. Or at least, I tried to. A week later, I saw her again. This time, it was on the subway. She was sitting across from me, her notebook open on her lap. She didn't notice me at first. She was too busy scribbling furiously. Her lips moved as she wrote, forming words I couldn't hear. "Clara?" I said. Her head snapped up, eyes wide with recognition. "You're still here," she said, almost accusingly. Yeah?" I said. "Why wouldn't I be?" She shook her head, muttering something under her breath. Then she tore a page out of her notebook and thrust it into my hands. "You need this," she said. I glanced down at the paper. It was covered in a series of drawings, circles, overlapping and connected by lines. In the center was a phrase written in jagged, frantic letters. "The gaps are getting bigger." "What does this mean?" I asked, but she was already gone, disappearing into the crowd like she'd never been there. That was when things started to change. It began with small moments, barely noticeable. I'd set my keys down on the counter and find them in my coat pocket an hour later. My phone would ring, but when I answered, there was nothing but static. Once, I was brushing my teeth and looked up to find the bathroom mirror empty. No reflection, just a blank, silvery void. When I blinked, everything was normal again. I didn't connect any of it to Clara until the night I woke up outside my apartment. The last thing I remembered was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone. Then I opened my eyes, and I was standing barefoot on the sidewalk, the streetlights casting long, eerie shadows. I looked up at my window, where the curtains were drawn shut, and felt a chill crawl up my spine. I wasn't sure if I had been sleepwalking or if something else had happened, but when I got back inside, I found another piece of paper on my kitchen table. It was torn from the same notebook Clara had been writing in, and it simply said, "You need to pay attention." The next time I saw Clara, I demanded answers. She was sitting on a bench in the park, the red scarf around her neck like a beacon. I marched up to her, waving the piece of paper. "What is this? What's happening to me?" "You're starting to notice," she said, not looking up. "That's good. But it also means they'll notice you." "Who's they?" I asked. Clara sighed, finally meeting my gaze. "The ones who live in the gaps. The spaces between seconds. Between memories. They're always there, watching, waiting. Most people can't see them. But once you do," her voice trailed off. "Once you do, what?" I pressed. She leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "They start to take you." I didn't believe her. How could I? It sounded insane. But the glitches, or whatever they were, kept happening. My reflection would lag behind me in the mirror. I'd step into an elevator and find myself on the wrong floor, even though I hadn't pressed any buttons. Time felt slippery, like it was stretching and compressing in ways it shouldn't. Then came the voices. They were faint at first, just whispers in the back of my mind. But they grew louder, more insistent, until I couldn't ignore them anymore. They said things I didn't understand. Numbers, names, fragments of sentences. Sometimes they laughed, a low, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. One night, I woke up to find my bedroom door open, even though I'd locked it before going to bed. Standing in the hallway was a figure, tall, featureless, its outline flickering like a broken hologram. It didn't move, but I felt its attention, heavy and suffocating. "Who are you?" I whispered. The figure tilted its head, and in that moment, I knew. It was one of them, the ones Clara had warned me about, the ones who lived in the gaps. I didn't wait to see what it would do. I ran, grabbing the notebook Clara had given me and bolting out the door. I found her at the park again, as if she had been waiting for me. "They're here," I said, out of breath. "What do I do?" She looked at me with a mix of pity and determination. "You have to fight them," she said, "but you can't do it alone." That was when I noticed the crowd. Dozens of people, all holding similar notebooks, standing silently behind Clara. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with the same fear I felt. "Welcome to the resistance," Clara said. And that was the moment I realized my life was never going to be the same. I wasn't looking for it. It wasn't even mine. It was tucked between the pages of a library book I borrowed. A novel so forgettable I can't even recall the title now. I flipped through the pages absent-mindedly one night, and the photograph slipped out, landing face up on the floor. It was old, sepia-toned, and slightly warped, showing a group of people standing in front of a white farmhouse. There were 6 of them, a man, a woman, and 4 children, all dressed in simple, old-fashioned clothing. They weren't smiling, none of them. But that wasn't what unsettled me. It was their eyes. Every single one of them had their gaze fixed directly on the camera, except for the smallest child, a girl who couldn't have been older than 5. She was staring at something out of frame, her expression frozen in a look of wide-eyed terror. I stared at the photo for a long time, unable to put it down. It felt wrong, though I couldn't explain why. Something about the way they stood, stiff and unnatural, like mannequins posed for display. I slid the photo back into the book, intending to return it to the library the next day. But when I went to bed that night, I dreamed of the girl. She was standing at the foot of my bed, wearing the same dress from the photograph. Her head was tilted to the side, and her mouth moved as if she were speaking, but no sound came out. Her hands were clutching something, though I couldn't see what. When I woke up, my heart racing, my room was dark and empty. But the feeling lingered, a sense of being watched, of something pressing against the edges of my awareness. I returned the book the next day, sliding it into the return slot with a sense of relief. I didn't tell anyone about the photo. What was there to say? But that night, when I turned back the covers to get into bed, the photograph was there. It was impossible. I knew I'd left it in the book. I stared at it for a long time before picking it up. This time, the girl wasn't looking out of frame anymore. She was looking at me. I threw it in the trash. The next morning, it was on my kitchen counter. I tried to ignore it. I shoved it into the back of a drawer and went about my day, but it was impossible to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept catching movement out of the corner of my eye, a flicker of white, like the edge of the girl's dress, disappearing around a corner. The air in the house felt heavier, charged with a static hum that made my skin crawl. By evening, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the photo from the drawer, drove to the edge of town, and tossed it into a dumpster behind an abandoned gas station. When I got home, it was waiting for me on my pillow. I don't know how to describe the terror that settled in my chest after that. I started seeing the girl everywhere, in reflections, in windows, standing at the edge of my vision. She was always silent, always watching. And the photograph, it started changing. The first change was subtle. The farmhouse in the background was slightly closer than before. Then the adults in the picture began to shift, their faces distorting, their eyes sinking deeper into their sockets. The last time I looked, their mouths had twisted into grotesque, gaping shapes, black and empty, like holes burned into the paper. I stopped sleeping. The girl's presence grew stronger at night, her silent form appearing in the darkest corners of my room. Once, I woke to find her crouched beside my bed, her wide, unblinking eyes inches from mine. I screamed, but she didn't move. She stayed there until the first light of dawn, then vanished. Desperation set in. I tried burning the photo. It didn't work. The flames licked the edges, curling them into ash, but when I looked down, it was intact, the faces staring back at me, more distorted than before. I buried it in the woods, but by the time I got back to the house, it was sitting on my kitchen table. One night, I thought I'd finally escaped. I threw the photograph into the river that cut through the edge of town, watching it sink beneath the rushing water. I went home, feeling the faintest glimmer of hope, and fell into an exhausted sleep. But I woke up to find water pooling on my bedroom floor, soaking into the carpet. The photograph was there, dripping wet, and the girl wasn't alone anymore. The other figures had moved closer to her, their hollow mouths stretched wider, their hands reaching toward her. Toward me. The whispers started that night, soft at first, just at the edge of hearing, growing louder with every passing hour. They spoke in a language I couldn't understand, but the intent behind them was clear. They were calling me, pulling me closer. I couldn't stay in the house anymore. I packed a bag and left, driving aimlessly for hours, until I found myself at an old motel off the highway. I didn't tell the clerk my name. I didn't even take the key. I just locked the door behind me and collapsed on the bed, exhausted. I should have known it wouldn't work. When I woke up, the photograph was lying on the bedside table. The girl's face was gone, her outline a smudged void in the paper. The other figures were closer now, their twisted hands pressed against the inside of the frame, as if they were trying to break free. I don't know what they want. I don't know what I did to deserve this. I'm writing this in the back seat of my car, parked at the edge of a highway that stretches endlessly into the night. I can feel them watching me, pressing against the barriers of this world like a tide waiting to break. The photograph is in the passenger seat. It's changing again. The figures are gone, and the farmhouse is in ruins, overtaken by shadow. But there's something new in the picture now, something rising out of the darkness, its form sharp and jagged, its mouth wide and black, just like theirs. It's closer every time I look. It started with the postcards. They arrived one by one, each postmarked from a different city I'd never been to, written in neat, looping handwriting I didn't recognize. The first one was from New Orleans, the picture on the front showing a dimly lit jazz bar. The message on the back was short and strange. I found it. Wish you were here. No name, no return address, just that cryptic sentence and my own name and address neatly written at the bottom. I almost tossed it in the trash, thinking it was some kind of marketing gimmick, but something about the handwriting stopped me. It felt personal, familiar in a way I couldn't quite place. The next one came 3 days later. This time, it was from Tokyo. The picture showed a narrow alley glowing with lanterns, the kind you see in travel brochures. The back read, "It's still beautiful, just like I remembered." I was unnerved, but curiosity had taken root. I stared at the postcard for hours, trying to remember if I'd ever met someone who lived in Tokyo or New Orleans, or anyone who traveled to both places in the same week. The handwriting was the same, looping and precise, but I still didn't recognize it. Then came Paris, Prague, Reykjavik. Each card arrived with the same crisp handwriting, the same unsettlingly vague messages. "The bridges are as strong as ever. They told me you'd understand someday. Not much time left." By the time the 8th postcard arrived, a stark black and white photo of a remote lighthouse somewhere off the Irish coast. I wasn't sleeping well. The message on this one wasn't cryptic anymore. It was urgent. Come now, before it's too late. I flipped the card over and stared at the postmark. Dingle, Ireland. I'd never been there. Hell, I'd never even heard of it. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that the message was meant for me, that someone out there was waiting, watching. The final postcard came a week later, and it was different. The image was blank, just a plain white card, and the message on the back was short. "It's here." The next morning, I woke up to the sound of scratching at my door. It wasn't loud, just a faint, intermittent scraping that could easily have been the wind or an animal outside. But when I opened the door, there was no one there. Just a single piece of paper lying on the welcome mat. It wasn't a postcard this time. It was a map. The map was hand-drawn, the lines clean and precise, and it showed a route from my apartment to a remote cabin in the woods about 3 hours away. At the bottom, in that same looping handwriting, was one word: come. Every rational part of my brain told me to ignore it. This was crazy. Who sends postcards to strangers and leaves cryptic maps on their doorstep? But something about the map pulled at me, like a thread I couldn't leave loose. The places from the postcards flashed in my mind: New Orleans, Tokyo, Paris, and I couldn't shake the feeling that if I didn't go, I'd regret it forever. The drive to the cabin was uneventful, though the further I went, the more the road seemed to narrow, the trees closing in around me like a tunnel. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was setting, the sky streaked with orange and pink. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the only sound was the crunch of gravel under my boots as I approached the door. It was unlocked. Inside, the cabin was sparsely furnished. A small table, a single chair, a bed pushed against the wall. But what caught my attention immediately was the mirror. It was massive, taking up nearly the entire back wall, its ornate gold frame gleaming even in the dim light. The glass was perfectly clear, so much so that for a moment, I thought it was just an open doorway to another room. I stepped closer, and that's when I saw it. The reflection wasn't right. At first, it was subtle, just the way the shadows fell slightly wrong, or the fact that the room in the mirror seemed a little brighter than the one I was standing in. But then I noticed myself. My reflection wasn't mirroring my movements. It was standing still, staring at me, its head tilted slightly to the side. "Hello," it said. The voice wasn't mine. It was softer, almost musical, but it echoed in my head like a memory. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, but the reflection didn't move. "You came," it said, its lips curling into a smile that didn't reach its eyes. "I was starting to think you'd forgotten. Who are you?" I managed to whisper, though my voice felt small and hollow in the room. The reflection tilted its head further, studying me like I was the one out of place. "You'll understand soon enough," it said. "But first, there's something you need to see." The glass rippled, like water, and suddenly the reflection was gone. In its place, the mirror showed a scene I didn't recognize. A narrow street lit by flickering gas lamps, the air thick with fog. A figure stood at the end of the street, their back to me, their head bowed as if in prayer. "Follow," the voice said. Before I could react, the glass rippled again, and the figure was gone. My reflection returned, staring at me with a knowing expression. "You always do," it said, and then it stepped forward. The glass shattered as my reflection moved out of the mirror and into the room. I stumbled back, tripping over the edge of the rug, but when I looked up, the cabin was gone. I was standing on that foggy street from the mirror, the gas lamps flickering above me, and the figure was waiting at the end of the road. I don't know how long I've been here. The postcards keep coming, even now. Each one shows another place, another moment I don't remember but feel like I should. The figure is always there, watching me from a distance, and the voice from the mirror lingers in my head, soft and insistent. "You'll understand soon enough." I don't think I want to. I moved into the house on Maplewood Lane at the end of October, right as the leaves were turning. It was an old Victorian, charming and a little eerie, with creaky floorboards and a front porch that sagged just enough to give it character. The previous owner had passed away, or so the realtor told me, and the house had sat empty for nearly a decade. It was exactly the kind of place I'd always dreamed of, a little rough around the edges, but full of potential. The first couple of weeks were uneventful. I spent my days unpacking, scrubbing years of grime off surfaces, and planning what colors I'd paint the walls. Most of the house had peeling wallpaper, faded floral patterns in shades of pink and green that felt decades out of date. I decided the first project would be the living room. It was the coziest space, with a bay window that let in soft afternoon light, and I wanted to make it my own. Stripping the wallpaper was harder than I expected. Beneath the top layer was another, older design. A dark, intricate pattern of vines and leaves, almost black against a deep green background. It felt heavier, suffocating, like it belonged in a completely different house. As I scraped it away, the air seemed to grow thick, the room darker. I blamed the lack of ventilation and the dust in the air, but it was unsettling. It wasn't until I reached the far corner of the room that I noticed the writing. At first, I thought it was just discoloration on the plaster beneath the wallpaper, but when I leaned closer, I realized they were words, faint but legible, scratched into the wall. "Don't let her out." The hair on my arm stood on end. I stared at the words, my scraper frozen mid-air. My first instinct was to laugh it off. A prank. Maybe. Some long-forgotten joke from whoever had lived here before. But something about the unevenness of the letters, the way they were gouged into the wall like someone had carved them in a hurry, made me uneasy. Still, I covered them up with a fresh coat of primer and moved on. That night, I woke up to the sound of scratching. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but once I noticed it, I couldn't unhear it. It was coming from the living room. My heart thudded as I crept down the stairs, clutching my phone like it was some sort of weapon. The scratching stopped the moment I flipped on the light. The room was empty, just as I'd left it. I checked the windows, the walls, even the floorboards, but there was no sign of mice or anything else that could have caused the noise. I went back to bed, telling myself it was just the house settling. The next morning, the words were back. I was drinking coffee in the living room, admiring the fresh paint, when I noticed it. Faint but unmistakable. The same words, in the same corner. "Don't let her out." I set my mug down so fast it spilled across the table. My pulse hammered in my ears. I grabbed a paintbrush and covered the words again, this time using 2 coats. By the time the paint dried, they were gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the house. Over the next few days, things escalated. The scratching returned, louder and more insistent, and it wasn't confined to the living room anymore. I heard it in the kitchen, the upstairs hallway, even my bedroom. Then there were the whispers, soft, almost mournful, just on the edge of hearing. At first, I thought it was the wind, but there was no breeze. And then, one night, I heard the voice. It was just after midnight, and I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when a woman's voice whispered, "Please." I bolted upright, my breath caught in my throat. "Who's there?" I croaked, my voice trembling. The room was silent. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, scanning the corners of the room, the closet, under the bed. Nothing. But as I sat there, clutching the phone like a lifeline, I realized the air had changed. It was colder, heavy with the smell of earth and rot. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I decided to investigate. The previous owner had passed away in the house, but the details were vague. Natural causes, the realtor had said. I called the library and dug through old newspapers, looking for anything about the house. That's when I found it. The obituary was straightforward enough. Eleanor Graves, age 72, passed away peacefully in her home on Maplewood Lane. But buried further down the page was another article. A police report from the same house, dated 20 years earlier. A woman had been found in the basement, locked in a small room behind a false wall. She'd been dead for weeks by the time anyone discovered her, and her name had never been released. The article was brief, but the final line stuck with me. Authorities suspect foul play, but no arrests have been made. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the basement. I'd only been down there once, long enough to store a few boxes. It was unfinished, cold and damp, with a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. The moment I opened the basement door, the smell hit me. Wet earth and decay. My hands shook as I descended the stairs, the flashlight beam trembling against the cinder block walls. At first, everything looked normal, but then I saw it. A faint seam in the wall at the far end of the room. It wasn't just a wall. It was a door. My breath came in shallow gasps as I pushed it open. The room beyond was small and dark, with crumbling walls and a dirt floor. In the center of the room was a single chair, and scratched into the wall above it were the same words I'd seen in the living room. "Don't let her out." I staggered back, my flashlight flickering. The air in the room felt alive, pressing against my chest. And then, behind me, the basement door slammed shut. The scratching started immediately, loud and frantic, coming from everywhere at once. The flashlight died, plunging me into darkness. I ran for the door, fumbling with the handle, but it wouldn't budge. And then, just behind me, the voice whispered again, "Please." The night began with a storm, a violent, thrashing thing that turned the city's streets into rivers and pounded on rooftops like a restless drumbeat. I had been working late at the bookstore, one of those cramped places stuffed with more memories than inventory, and by the time I locked up, the rain was relentless. My umbrella was no match for the wind, which twisted it into a useless frame before I made it half a block. Soaked and irritated, I ducked into the nearest alley to catch my breath. That's when I saw it. Tucked between two brick buildings was a door. It shouldn't have been there. I'd walked this block countless times, and there was never a door. But there it stood, solid and dark, with ornate carvings along its frame that seemed to shimmer even in the dim light. Above it, a small sign read, "The Midway Club." No neon, no flashing lights. Just those three words, understated but magnetic. I was about to walk away when the door creaked open and warm, golden light spilled out. A man appeared, sharply dressed in a burgundy suit that looked like it had been plucked from a bygone era. His face was handsome but unsettling, his features too perfect, like a painting brought to life. He smiled, and it was both inviting and dangerous. "Care to step in out of the rain?" he asked, his voice smooth and melodic. I hesitated. There were rules about this kind of thing, weren't there? Doors that appeared out of nowhere, strange men with two perfect smiles. But the rain was unrelenting, and something about the warmth spilling from the doorway called to me. Against my better judgment, I nodded. The man stepped aside, gesturing for me to enter. The air inside was heavy with the scent of incense and old leather, the kind of atmosphere that wrapped around you and whispered secrets you weren't ready to hear. The room was circular, with walls lined by shelves filled with objects. An antique compass, a faded photograph, a lock of hair tied with red string. In the center, a round table sat under a chandelier that dripped with crystals, casting fractured light in every direction. Other patrons were scattered around, each absorbed in quiet conversation or solitary contemplation. They didn't look up as I entered, their faces obscured by the soft glow of candles. The man in the burgundy suit closed the door behind me and extended a hand. "Welcome to the Midway Club. I'm Felix." I shook his hand, his grip cool but firm. "What is this place?" Felix's smile widened, and he gestured to the room. "It's exactly what it needs to be. For some, it's a haven. For others, a crossroads. But for you," he paused, his eyes glinting as if he could see through my skin. "For you, it's an opportunity." I felt a flicker of unease. Opportunity for what? Felix tilted his head, as if considering how much to say. "The club offers something unique to everyone who steps inside. A chance to gain what you've lost, or perhaps what you never had." The room seemed to grow warmer, the air heavier. "I'm not sure I understand," I said, though part of me already did. Felix gestured toward the table in the center of the room. "Take a seat. You'll understand soon enough." I didn't remember moving, but suddenly I was sitting at the table, its surface smooth and cold under my fingertips. A deck of cards lay in the center, their edges gilded with gold. Felix sat across from me, his movements languid as he shuffled the cards. The room fell silent, the murmurs of the other patrons fading into nothing. "This game," Felix began, laying the deck before me, "is not about luck. It's about choice. Each card will reveal something about you, a memory, a fear, a desire. The game ends when you walk away, or when the deck decides it's over. What happens if I win?" I asked. Felix's smile was maddeningly cryptic. "Winning is relative." "And if I lose?" His eyes gleamed. "You won't leave empty-handed." The cards beckoned, their gilded edges catching the light. Against every rational thought, I reached out and drew the first card. It depicted a house engulfed in flames. As soon as I laid it on the table, the memory hit me like a wave. The fire that destroyed my childhood home, the smoke choking my lungs, the sound of my mother's voice calling out my name. I hadn't thought about it in years, but now it was all-consuming, vivid, and raw. Felix studied me. The past shapes us, but it doesn't define us. Draw again. I did. The next card showed a shadowy figure holding a blade. Fear clawed at my chest as I recalled the night I was mugged. How powerless I'd felt. How the cold steel pressed against my skin had left a scar far deeper than the one on my arm. The game continued, each card peeling back a layer of my life. Joys I had buried, failures I tried to forget, dreams I'd abandoned. With every card, the room seemed to change, the shelves and objects rearranging themselves as if responding to the story unfolding before them. When the deck was nearly spent, I drew a card that was completely blank. I stared at it, confused. Felix leaned forward, his gaze sharp. This is your future. Unwritten, undefined. The most dangerous card of all. I swallowed hard. What am I supposed to do with it? Felix's smile returned, but there was no warmth in it. That depends. Are you ready to choose? The room seemed to hold its breath, the air crackling with anticipation. I looked at the blank card, then at Felix, then at the door that had brought me here. The weight of the game pressed down on me, and I realized I wasn't just playing for answers. I was playing for myself. I placed the blank card on the table. I choose to write my own future. Felix's eyes flashed, and for a moment, the room seemed to tremble. Then he leaned back, slow applause echoing in the silence. Well played. The golden light dimmed, and when I blinked, I was standing outside in the rain again. The door to the Midway Club was gone, replaced by a graffiti-covered wall. My clothes were dry, the storm now a faint drizzle. In my hand, I held the blank card, and on its surface, faint but unmistakable, were the first lines of a story only I could write. One ordinary Tuesday evening, I found a manila envelope on my kitchen counter. I lived alone. No roommates, no visitors, and certainly no memory of leaving anything there. My first thought was that I'd forgotten buying something, but as soon as I picked it up, the weight in my hand felt wrong, too light, too fragile. Inside were 5 Polaroids. The first photo was of my living room, taken from a strange angle, like someone had crouched in the corner near the bookshelf. The shot was oddly grainy, but I could make out the details. The couch cushions slightly askew, the coffee cup I'd left on the table, the TV remote halfway under the rug. The second photo showed my bedroom. The angle this time was more direct, as if whoever took it had stood at the foot of my bed. My blankets were tangled, one corner hanging off the mattress, the way they looked when I left that morning. The third photo was of my kitchen. This one felt closer. The counter was visible, along with the sink full of dishes I'd been too lazy to clean. My own handwriting on the sticky note stuck to the fridge. Pick up milk. By the fourth photo, my hands were trembling. It was a shot of me. I was sitting on the couch, mid-laugh. My head tilted slightly back, as if someone had just told me the funniest joke. My mouth was open, my teeth bared, my face glowing with a happiness I didn't recognize. But the detail that made my stomach churn was my clothing. I didn't own the sweatshirt I was wearing in the photo. The fifth and final photo made my knees buckle. It was of me again. This time, I wasn't laughing. I was lying in bed, my eyes wide open, staring at the camera. My face looked pale, almost translucent in the flash. My mouth was slightly ajar, and there was something off about the way my arms lay at my sides. Too stiff, too perfect. The timestamp on the bottom corner read, 2:34 a.m. I didn't know how to process it. I hadn't laughed on my couch that day. I hadn't even worn anything remotely like that sweatshirt. And the photo of me in bed, was it a prank? Some cruel trick? I went to the front door and checked the locks. Still bolted. Every window was sealed. My stomach felt like it was filled with lead. I couldn't sleep that night. Every creak in the house felt like footsteps. Every gust of wind against the windows made my heart race. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing loudly on the nightstand. There was a new text from an unknown number. Do you like the photos? I dropped the phone immediately, backing away from the bed like it might explode. My mind raced. Who could have sent this? How had they taken those pictures? My phone buzzed again. You should smile more. It suits you. The fear turned to anger. I snatched the phone and typed back furiously, "Who was this? What do you want?" No response came. The next morning, I found another envelope. It was on my porch this time, propped against the door. My hands shook as I opened it, pulling out another set of Polaroids. The first was of me standing at my front door, holding my phone, looking down at the screen. The second showed me asleep on the couch, my mouth slightly open. The third was of my hallway, taken at night, the light faint but unmistakable. The fourth was the worst. It was of my bathroom mirror, and in the reflection, I could see myself brushing my teeth. But there was someone else in the room with me, a figure just barely visible in the corner of the shot. Their face was obscured, but their posture was stiff, unnatural, as if they didn't belong in the space at all. I dropped the photos and ran to the bathroom, flicking on the light. The mirror was empty. No figure. No signs of anything unusual, except for the writing on the corner of the mirror. It was faint, almost imperceptible, written in what looked like the remnants of steam. 3 words, "We're not done." I scrubbed the mirror clean, my mind racing. Should I call the police? What would I even say? Someone had broken in, yes, but nothing was taken. I had no evidence, just a growing sense of unease. The texts didn't stop. At first, they were infrequent, random, chilling messages like, "You were so peaceful last night," or "Do you ever wonder who's watching?" Then they started coming in clusters, dozens at a time. My phone would buzz non-stop, filling up with messages, "It's all for you. We're getting closer. Check the basement." I didn't have a basement. One night, I received a text that simply read, "Look outside." I hesitated for what felt like hours, clutching my phone in one hand and a heavy lamp in the other. When I finally gathered the courage to part the curtains, my stomach dropped. There was nothing, just an empty street bathed in the pale glow of the streetlights. But then I saw it, a figure standing perfectly still on the sidewalk across the street. They were facing my house, their posture stiff and unnatural, like the figure from the bathroom photo. My phone buzzed again. "You're looking the wrong way." I froze. Slowly, I turned around, and there, in the reflection of the living room window, was someone standing behind me. I grew up in a small, unremarkable town where nothing ever seemed to happen. It was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked, where the most exciting thing was the annual county fair. But everyone knew about the missing hour. It was a local legend, whispered in hushed tones by kids at sleepovers or bored teens daring each other to investigate. The story went like this. Every so often, at exactly 3:14 a.m., the clocks in town would jump forward to 4:14 a.m. Phones, watches, wall clocks, everything would skip ahead, erasing an entire hour. People claimed they never noticed it until they checked the time, and suddenly it was later than it should have been. Most of the adults dismissed it as a joke, a glitch in cheap clocks, or people forgetting to adjust for daylight saving. But for as long as I could remember, there were rumors, whispers about things that happened during that missing hour, things people couldn't explain. When I was 17, I experienced it myself. It was late July, one of those sticky, restless summer nights where the air feels too thick to breathe. My parents were out of town, and I'd invited a few friends over for movies and pizza. By 1:30 a.m., we were sprawled out on the living room floor, half asleep and surrounded by empty soda cans. My best friend, Kyle, suggested we stay up all night. "You know," he said with a grin, "in case we lose the hour." I rolled my eyes, but part of me was intrigued. I'd heard the stories growing up, and while I didn't believe them, there was a small, nagging part of me that wanted to see for myself. So, we made a pact. No one was allowed to fall asleep. We passed the time playing cards and making fun of the cheesy horror movie still playing in the background. By 3:10 a.m., the room was eerily quiet. The excitement had worn off, replaced by an uncomfortable tension none of us wanted to acknowledge. The clock on the microwave read 3:12 when the lights flickered. It wasn't a power outage, it was more like a glitch. The lights dimmed for a second, then returned to normal. The TV turned itself off, the screen fading to black without so much as a hiss of static. My phone, lying face up on the coffee table, buzzed once before the screen froze. Kyle laughed nervously. Guess the power grid's having a moment. Yeah, I said, trying to sound casual. Weird. Then the clock on the microwave blinked. 3:13. The numbers flickered, almost as if they were struggling to stay in place. The air felt heavier, and my ears popped like I'd gone up a mountain too fast. I turned to Kyle, about to suggest we check the breaker box, when it happened. The world shifted. That's the only way I can describe it. 1 second, I was sitting on the living room floor with my friends, and the next, everything was wrong. The room was the same, but it wasn't. The furniture was still there, but it was covered in a fine layer of dust. The colors seemed muted, like someone had drained the life out of them. And the silence, it was absolute. No hum of the fridge, no chirp of crickets outside, not even the faint buzz of electricity in the walls. Just nothing. Guys, I whispered, my voice barely audible in the suffocating quiet. Kyle and the others were still there, but they weren't moving. They sat frozen in place, eyes open and unfocused, like mannequins. I reached out to shake Kyle's shoulder, but he didn't respond. His skin felt cold, clammy, and I pulled my hand back instinctively. That's when I heard it. A faint, distant sound, like footsteps on gravel. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder with each passing second. I turned toward the front window, my pulse hammering in my ears. The street outside was shrouded in an unnatural fog, so thick it seemed to press against the glass. The footsteps stopped just outside the house. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. A shadow moved through the fog, tall and angular, its movements unnaturally smooth. It stopped in front of the window, and for a moment, I thought it was looking directly at me, though it didn't have a face. Just a blank, featureless void where its face should have been. The front door creaked. I turned, my stomach dropping as I saw the doorknob twisting slowly. The door swung open with a soft groan, and the thing stepped inside. It was impossibly tall, its head brushing the ceiling, and its limbs were too long, its proportions all wrong. It moved with an unsettling grace, its blank head swiveling unnaturally as if scanning the room. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I thought maybe if I stayed still, it wouldn't notice me. But then it turned, its head tilting slightly, and I knew it had seen me. It took a step forward, and then another, its long fingers twitching as it reached toward me. I stumbled back, tripping over a pile of cushions and landing hard on the floor. My phone buzzed again, the screen lighting up with a sudden, blinding glow. For a split second, the thing recoiled, its featureless head snapping toward the light. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything shifted again. The lights were back, the TV hummed to life, and the clock on the microwave blinked. 4:14 a.m. The air felt normal again, and the oppressive silence was gone, replaced by the familiar sounds of the night. My friends stirred, blinking groggily as if they'd just woken up. What happened? Kyle asked, rubbing his eyes. Did we fall asleep? I didn't answer. My hands were shaking, and my heart felt like it was trying to claw its way out of my chest. I glanced at the front door. It was shut, locked, as if nothing had happened. But when I looked down, I saw it. A single, dark smudge on the floor, shaped like a footprint. I never told anyone what happened that night. Not Kyle, not my parents, not the town priest who gave a sermon the following Sunday about strange times. I moved away from that town the second I graduated, and I never went back. But every so often, when I'm awake in the middle of the night, I'll glance at the clock and feel a shiver of dread, because I know what happens when the hour disappears, and I know that whatever is out there in the dark is still watching, waiting. The first time I saw the old man was on a Wednesday. I was walking my dog, Maisie, through the woods behind my new house. It was the kind of day that almost didn't feel real. The sunlight slanted through the trees just right, the air smelled like rain that hadn't yet come, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves underfoot. Maisie stopped suddenly, her ears perked, and let out a low growl. That's when I noticed him. He was sitting on a fallen log about 50 feet ahead, half hidden in the dappled light. His clothes were odd, faded overalls, a moth-eaten sweater, and boots that looked more like props from a Civil War reenactment than anything practical. His face was shadowed by the brim of a wide, floppy hat, but I could see enough to know he was old. Too old, I thought, to be wandering this deep into the woods alone. "Hello?" I called out, feeling awkward. The man didn't respond. He just sat there, as still as a statue, staring at something in his hands. Maisie barked once, a sharp, nervous sound that echoed through the trees. The man tilted his head ever so slightly, as if he'd heard her but didn't quite understand what she was. I hesitated, then took a step closer. "Hey, are you okay? Do you need help?" That's when he looked up. I can't explain what it was about his face that unsettled me. At a glance, he looked normal, weathered and lined, with a scruffy white beard. But his eyes were too bright, not in a lively or friendly way, but in a way that felt wrong, like they didn't belong to him. They were the kind of eyes you see in a bird of prey, sharp and hungry. "I'm fine," he said, his voice raspy and low, like the wind through dead leaves. He smiled then, and it wasn't a smile meant to reassure. It was the kind of smile that felt like a warning. I didn't know what to say, so I muttered something about the weather and tugged Maisie's leash, hurrying her along the path. I didn't look back. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about him. What had he been doing out there? What was he holding? It had looked like a rock, maybe, or a chunk of wood. I convinced myself it didn't matter. The woods were public property, after all. He could be there if he wanted to. Still, I double-checked the locks on all my doors before I went to bed. The next morning, I found something on my porch. It was a small bundle wrapped in dirty cloth. Inside was a bird's skull, perfectly clean, with bits of moss tucked into its hollow eye sockets. I stared at it for a long time, my stomach churning. I wanted to believe it was just some neighborhood kid pulling a prank, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. That afternoon, I went back into the woods. Maisie was reluctant, her tail tucked low as she sniffed at the air, but I was determined to figure out what was going on. I followed the same path as before, looking for any sign of the old man. The woods felt different this time. Darker, even though the sun was still shining, and quieter, like the birds had all decided to go somewhere else. I found the log where he'd been sitting, but he wasn't there. Instead, I found another bundle. This one was tied with a strip of leather, and when I opened it, I nearly dropped it. Inside was a small wooden carving, roughly hewn but unmistakable. It was me. The figure wore the same jacket I'd been wearing the day before, and in one hand, it held a leash attached to a little dog that looked exactly like Maisie. I stuffed the carving back into the bundle and left, practically dragging Maisie behind me. By the time I got home, I was shaking. I locked the doors again, closed all the curtains, and spent the rest of the day jumping at every little sound. That night, I had a dream. In the dream, I was back in the woods, but they were different. The trees were taller, their branches twisted together to form a canopy so thick it blocked out the sky. The air was heavy, and the ground was covered in a thick carpet of moss that seemed to pulse beneath my feet. The old man was there, standing a few yards away with his back to me. He turned slowly, his two bright eyes glowing in the darkness. He was holding another carving, but this one wasn't of me. It was of a house. My house. When I woke up, the first thing I did was check the windows. Everything seemed normal. The house was still, the morning light streaming through the gaps in the curtains. I told myself it was just a nightmare. That's all it was. But when I went to let Maisie out, I froze. Sitting in the middle of my kitchen table was the carving from the woods. The little figure of me holding Maisie's leash, its rough features now smeared with what looked like ash. I didn't bring it inside. I know I didn't. I called the police, but they were less than helpful. The officer who showed up, a bored-looking man in his 40s, gave the carving a cursory glance and shrugged. "Probably just a kid messing around," he said. I didn't argue. What would have been the point? He didn't see what I saw in the old man's eyes. He didn't feel the woods pressing down like a living thing. That was 3 days ago. Since then, the carvings have kept coming. A bird, a tree, a figure that looks like my neighbor. Each one shows up in the same place, always smeared with ash. Last night, I heard something outside. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the house. This morning, I found a new carving on my porch. It was of me again, but this time I wasn't holding Maisie's leash. I was lying on the ground, my face twisted in a scream, with the old man standing over me. I'm writing this because I don't know what else to do. I don't think the police can help me, and I don't think I can leave. The woods go on for miles, and I don't have anywhere else to go. Just now, I heard a creak outside my window. Maisie is growling, her ears pinned back. I don't want to look, but I have to. If you're reading this, and I don't post again, don't come looking for me. Stay out of the woods. And whatever you do, don't talk to the old man. It started with a voicemail. I had just finished unpacking in my new apartment, a modest one-bedroom in a building that probably peaked in the 1970s. The walls were thin, the carpet was an unflattering shade of beige, and the elevator always groaned like it might give up on life mid-ride. Still, it was cheap and close to work. I wasn't looking for luxury, just a place to call home. The voicemail came late that night. I hadn't even set up my furniture yet, just a mattress on the floor and a few boxes stacked around the living room. My phone buzzed, and I saw the notification. New voicemail. I hadn't heard it ring. The message was scratchy, the kind of low-quality audio that makes you lean closer as if that'll help. At first, it sounded like static. Then, buried under the hiss, I heard it, a faint whisper. Don't go near the window. It wasn't a prank call. The voice was too low, too deliberate. The way it drew out the words made my skin crawl. I replayed it 3 times, trying to make sense of it. The number was blocked. My brain immediately tried to rationalize it. Wrong number. Kids messing around. A glitch. But when I looked up at the window, I froze. The blinds were open. Outside, the streetlights cast faint pools of orange on the cracked pavement, but the space right outside my window, an alleyway between my building and the one next door, was completely dark. I couldn't see anything. No reflections, no shapes, just blackness. I pulled the blinds shut and told myself I was being ridiculous. The next morning, I convinced myself it was just some weird one-off. I had plenty to distract me, like the stack of boxes waiting to be unpacked and the clock ticking down to Monday. By the afternoon, I'd almost forgotten about it. Almost. That night, as I was brushing my teeth, I heard it, a soft tapping. At first, I thought it was coming from the bathroom pipes. Old buildings do that sometimes. But as I stood there, toothbrush in hand, I realized it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from the window. Tap, tap, tap. I stepped into the living room, heart racing, and stared at the blinds. The tapping stopped. My hand hovered over the cord to pull them open, but I couldn't do it. Instead, I backed away, double-checked that the front door was locked, and went to bed with a chair wedged under the knob. I didn't sleep. The next day, I tried to tell myself it was just a tree branch or some animal outside. But when I looked out the window in the daylight, there was nothing. No trees, no ledges, nothing that could have made that sound. The alley was bare, just cracked concrete and graffiti-covered walls. The voicemail didn't come again, but the tapping did. Every night. Sometimes faint, sometimes louder, always deliberate. A week in, I finally told someone. My coworker Lily was the kind of no-nonsense person who could talk you out of anything from buying overpriced shoes to spiraling over creepy voicemails. So, don't go near the window, she said, like it was the simplest thing in the world. Very helpful, I replied, rolling my eyes. What if it's some creep? Then call the cops, she said, shrugging. Or move. You know, like a normal person. But I didn't call the cops, and I didn't move. Something about it felt wrong. Like it wasn't the kind of thing they could help with. Instead, I bought heavier curtains and told myself I was being paranoid. That night, I dreamed of the window. In the dream, the blinds were gone. I was standing in the living room, staring at the glass, and something was staring back. I couldn't see it clearly, just a faint shape pressed against the window, like condensation outlining a figure. Its head tilted too far to one side, and then it moved. It pressed a hand to the glass. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. The room was silent except for my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I didn't dare look at the window. By the second week, I started noticing other things. Shadows where they shouldn't be. The sound of footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment, but no one there when I checked. My neighbor, a quiet man in his 50s who mostly kept to himself, stopped me one day and asked if I'd been hearing things at night. What kind of things? I asked. He hesitated, looking over his shoulder before leaning in. Tapping, like someone knocking. On the glass. I lied and told him no. That night, the tapping didn't come. At first, I felt relief, but then I realized something was worse about the silence. It wasn't just quiet, it was waiting. Around midnight, my phone buzzed again. New voicemail. I almost didn't check it, but my thumb moved on its own, pulling it up and hitting play. This time, the voice wasn't whispering. It was louder, more urgent. Don't let it in. I dropped the phone, my hands shaking. Before I could process it, I heard the sound I'd been dreading, the tapping. But this time, it wasn't coming from the living room window. It was coming from the bedroom. I turned, slowly, my stomach knotting. The blinds were closed, but the fabric of the curtain was pressed inward, like something was leaning against it. The tapping grew louder. Tap, tap, tap. I backed toward the door, fumbling for the handle. The curtain started to move, just slightly, as if something was brushing against it. I didn't wait to see what it was. I ran out of the apartment, barefoot and in my pajamas, and didn't stop until I was in my car. I drove to a 24-hour diner on the other side of town and sat in the parking lot, shaking and staring at the phone in my lap. Another voicemail came. This time, I didn't listen to it. I just turned off the phone and drove until the sun came up. I haven't been back to the apartment since. The landlord has called me 3 times, but I won't answer. Sometimes, though, when I'm alone at night, I hear it again. Tap, 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 and I wonder if I've brought it with me. I don't talk about what happened at the motel often. Part of me still wonders if it really happened, or if my mind twisted things in the dark. But every time I pass a rundown roadside inn, the memories come flooding back, and I feel that familiar chill creep up my spine. It was late November, just after Thanksgiving. I was on my way back home after visiting my family, driving through a stretch of desolate backroads that seemed to go on forever. The GPS had rerouted me due to construction, and I was stuck in the middle of nowhere. It was almost midnight, and the rain was coming down in thick sheets, blurring the road ahead. My eyelids were heavy, and every mile felt like a battle to keep the car straight. That's when I saw the flickering neon sign, Red Pine Lodge, vacancy. It wasn't a chain motel or anything remotely modern. It was the kind of place with peeling paint and a parking lot full of potholes. But at that moment, it was a godsend. I pulled in, parking under a flickering street lamp. The office was small, with a dingy, open sign hanging in the window. Inside, the air smelled stale, like old coffee and mildew. The man behind the counter looked as worn as the place itself. Gray hair, wrinkled face, eyes that didn't quite meet mine when I walked in. "Need a room?" he asked, his voice gravelly. "Just for the night," I replied, digging my wallet out of my bag. He handed me a key attached to a cracked plastic tag with the number 6 on it. "Don't lose it," he said, staring at me a little too long. "And don't wander around outside. Things get strange out here at night." I gave a nervous laugh, assuming he was joking. He didn't laugh back. The room was about what you'd expect for $40 a night. A lumpy bed, faded wallpaper, a TV that looked older than I was. I dropped my bag on the floor, kicked off my shoes, and collapsed onto the bed, too tired to care about the questionable stains on the comforter. The rain outside was relentless, and I found the sound oddly soothing. I was out within minutes. I woke up sometime later to a noise. At first, I thought it was just the rain, but then I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, just outside the window. My room was on the ground floor, and the curtains were drawn, but I could see the faint shadow of someone moving back and forth in front of the window. I sat up, my heart pounding. Maybe it was just another guest. Maybe they were lost, trying to find their room. I stayed still, listening, and the footsteps stopped. A long silence followed, and then came a sound that made my blood run cold. A soft knock at the door. It wasn't a normal knock. It was light, almost playful, like whoever was on the other side wasn't in any hurry. I crept out of bed, my pulse racing, and peered through the peephole. No one was there. Just the rain and the faint glow of the street lamp outside. Another knock, louder this time. I backed away, grabbing my phone off the nightstand. The logical part of my brain told me to call the front desk, but when I unlocked the screen, there was no signal. Of course, I was in the middle of nowhere, relying on the motel's non-existent Wi-Fi. "Who's there?" I finally called out, my voice trembling. No answer. The knocking stopped, replaced by the faint sound of breathing. It was coming from the other side of the door, heavy and labored, like whoever was out there was inches away from the wood. I grabbed the chair from the corner of the room and wedged it under the doorknob, my hands shaking. The breathing stopped abruptly, and for a moment, all I could hear was the rain. I thought maybe they'd gone, but then I heard it, a low whisper, just loud enough to make out. "Room 6, it said, drawn out and slow. "I see you." I froze, my back pressed against the far wall, my eyes darting to the window. The shadow was back, moving past the curtains, pausing for a moment before sliding out of view. My chest tightened. I wasn't going to wait around to see what came next. I grabbed my bag, my car keys, and the chair, ready to make a run for it. I eased the chair away from the door, my heart hammering in my ears. I had to be quick. I swung the door open, and the hallway was empty. Just rain pooling on the pavement outside. I sprinted to my car, the cold rain drenching me instantly. I threw my bag into the passenger seat and slammed the door, fumbling with the keys. My hands were trembling so badly, it took me 3 tries to get the engine to turn over. The headlights flicked on, illuminating the parking lot. And that's when I saw him. The man from the front desk, standing in the middle of the lot, his face blank and expressionless, his arms hanging limply at his sides. He wasn't holding an umbrella, wasn't flinching as the rain poured down his face. He just stood there, staring at me. I threw the car into reverse, nearly hitting a pothole as I backed out. When I shifted into drive and sped toward the exit, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and the man was gone. The lot was empty. I didn't stop driving until I was 2 towns over, pulling into the parking lot of a well-lit diner. I sat there for a while, my hands still gripping the steering wheel, trying to process what had just happened. The next morning, I decided to report it. I called the local sheriff's office, explaining what had happened and giving them the name of the motel. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before the deputy spoke. "Red Pine Lodge," he said, his voice cautious. "That place burned down years ago. Electrical fire. Killed the owner and a couple of guests. Are you sure that's where you stayed?" I hung up without answering. I didn't want to know the answer. It started with a message on my phone. I'd been scrolling aimlessly in bed, the glow of the screen the only light in the room. At first, I thought it was a text from a friend, but when I opened it, I realized it wasn't from anyone in my contacts. The message was brief. "Found you." I stared at it, feeling a twinge of unease. "Spam, maybe?" I typed back, "Who is this?" No response. I set the phone down and turned out the light, chalking it up to a wrong number. The next morning, the message was gone. Not in my inbox, not in the trash, nowhere. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I would have thought I'd imagined it. But the unease lingered. That night, another message came through. "Do you remember me?" This time, I didn't respond. I stared at the screen, half tempted to block the number, but something stopped me. There was a strange familiarity about the question, like a voice from a dream you can't quite place. I locked my phone and set it down, trying to shake off the feeling. The next morning, my phone wasn't where I'd left it. It was on the floor, half hidden under the bed. I must have knocked it over in my sleep, I told myself. But when I picked it up, the screen lit up with a new message. "I never forgot you." Goosebumps crawled up my arms. I tapped the number, hoping to find some clue about the sender, but there was nothing. No name, no profile picture, no call history. Just the messages. I turned the phone off and shoved it into a drawer, deciding I'd had enough. But the messages didn't stop. The next night, my phone buzzed again. I ignored it. A minute later, it buzzed again. Then again, and again. Frustrated, I yanked the phone out of the drawer and turned it on. The screen was flooded with messages, one after another, all saying the same thing: look outside." My heart thudded painfully in my chest. The blinds were drawn, the window behind them a dark, impenetrable void. For a moment, I thought about ignoring the messages, but then the phone buzzed again, and this time the message read, "You need to see." I stood, the floor creaking beneath my feet. With trembling hands, I reached for the cord and pulled the blinds open. The street was empty, just as it always was at that hour. My apartment sat at the edge of a quiet cul-de-sac where nothing ever happened. But as I stared out into the darkness, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. A single figure standing beneath the streetlight. They were motionless, their face obscured by the shadow of a hood. My phone buzzed again. "Do you remember me now?" The figure didn't move, but I felt their gaze, heavy and cold, like a hand pressing against my chest. I couldn't breathe. I stumbled back, pulling the blinds shut and locking the window. For hours, I sat in the dark, clutching the phone but too afraid to look at it. When I finally gathered the courage to check, there were no new messages. But there was a photograph. It was of my apartment building, taken from the street. The timestamp showed it had been taken minutes earlier. The next day, I called the police. They checked the area but found no sign of anyone. The number that had been texting me was untraceable. "Probably a prank," the officer said, but his expression betrayed his uncertainty. That night, I didn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the pipes made me jump. I kept the blinds tightly shut, but in the morning, when I opened them, I saw something that made my stomach drop. There were footprints in the dirt outside my window. They didn't lead away from the building. They led toward it. I packed a bag and left the apartment, checking into a motel on the other side of town. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I turned off my phone and left it in my suitcase. For 2 days, I tried to convince myself it was over, that I'd overreacted. But on the third night, the phone turned itself back on. It buzzed once. A new message, "I found you again." I wanted to throw the phone against the wall, but instead, I did something I hadn't done before. I replied, "What do you want from me?" The answer came almost instantly. To finish what we started. I had no idea what that meant. I had no idea who this person was or what they thought we'd started. But the worst part was that strange, gnawing familiarity. The feeling that some part of me did know, that I'd just forgotten. That night, I dreamed of a place I hadn't thought about in years. The woods behind the house where I'd grown up. In the dream, I was running through the trees, the sound of footsteps chasing me, too close, too fast. I tripped and fell, and when I turned to look back, I saw a face leaning over me, pale, hollow-eyed, smiling. When I woke up, my phone was in my hand, and the screen displayed another message. "The woods. You remember now, don't you?" I don't know why I did it. Maybe I thought it would end if I played along. Maybe I was just too tired to fight it anymore. But I drove back to my hometown, to the woods from my dream. The trees were taller than I remembered, their branches intertwining to block out the sky. As I walked deeper into the forest, the world grew eerily silent, as if the woods were holding their breath. And then I saw it. A clearing, just as I dreamed it, with a single figure standing in the center. They turned to face me, and my blood ran cold. It was the same face from the dream, the same hollow eyes and terrible smile. They took a step toward me, and then another, until they were close enough that I could feel their breath. "Do you remember me now?" they whispered. And suddenly, I did. The first time I saw the girl, it was in the reflection of a puddle. It had rained all night, the kind of heavy storm that makes you question your roof's integrity. By morning, the world was wet and gleaming, and I was already running late. I was half jogging to catch the bus when I stepped around a particularly deep puddle near the curb. That's when I saw her. In the puddle's reflection, there was a girl standing behind me. Pale, thin, with long, dark hair dripping wet like she just crawled out of the rainstorm. She wore a white dress stained gray at the hem. Her face wasn't clear, but her eyes were wide, unblinking, and locked onto me. I spun around, but the street was empty. No girl, just the faint sound of water rushing into a storm drain. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a distorted reflection of a tree branch or a passing car. But as I turned to walk away, I caught another glimpse of her, still in the puddle, still watching. I didn't sleep well that night. The sound of dripping water seemed to echo through my apartment. At first, I thought it was from the faucet, but when I checked, everything was dry. The dripping continued, faint and rhythmic, like it was coming from inside the walls. The next day, she appeared again. This time, it was in the glass door of the coffee shop I frequent. I was in line, fumbling with my wallet, when I caught a glimpse of her reflection behind me. She was standing just outside the door, the same soaking wet dress clinging to her body, her hair plastered to her face. Her eyes bored into mine through the glass. I turned so quickly I nearly knocked over the guy in front of me. The sidewalk was crowded with morning commuters, but she wasn't there. Just the usual blur of people rushing to work, heads down, earbuds in. When I turned back to the door, her reflection was gone. By the third day, she wasn't just in reflections anymore. I was brushing my teeth, leaning over the sink, when I felt the faintest touch, wet and cold, on the back of my neck. I straightened so fast I nearly choked on toothpaste. The bathroom mirror was fogged from the shower, but through the condensation, I could just make out her outline. She was standing in the corner of the room, her head tilted slightly, water pooling around her bare feet. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I stood there, gripping the edge of the sink, my breath fogging the mirror further, until the room fell silent. When I finally mustered the courage to look back, the corner was empty. But the floor was wet, the faint outline of footprints leading out of the bathroom and into the hall. I didn't sleep that night. The dripping sound had returned, louder this time, coming from somewhere in my bedroom. I turned on every light, checked every corner, but the room was dry. Still, the sound continued, steady and deliberate, until it felt like it was inside my skull. The next morning, I found a puddle at the foot of my bed. It wasn't big, just a small pool of water soaking into the carpet, but in the middle of it, something glinted. I crouched down and picked it up. It was a silver locket, tarnished and cold to the touch. The clasp was broken, but when I pried it open, I found a small, water-damaged photo inside. It was hard to make out, but I could just barely see the face of a young girl staring back at me. Her eyes were hollow. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to throw the locket away, to get rid of it and pretend none of this was happening. But something about it felt familiar, like I'd seen it before, though I couldn't remember where. I slipped it into my pocket and left the apartment, desperate to be anywhere but there. She was waiting for me in the subway. I was standing on the platform, the locket heavy in my jacket, when I saw her on the opposite side of the tracks. She was dripping wet, her hair clinging to her face, her dress dark with water. This time, she didn't stay still. She stepped closer to the edge of the platform, her bare feet silent against the concrete. Her head tilted as she stared at me, her eyes like black holes. The train roared into the station, its lights cutting through the dimness, and for a moment, I lost sight of her. But as the train passed, I saw her reflection in the windows. She was standing right behind me. I didn't wait for the next train. I ran, up the stairs, through the turnstiles, out into the street. The locket burned in my pocket, the weight of it pulling me down. By the time I made it home, I was soaked in sweat, my breath ragged. That night, I dreamt of water. Endless, dark water. I was sinking, the cold pressing against my chest, the weight of it dragging me down. When I opened my eyes, I saw her. She was below me, reaching up, her fingers brushing against my ankle. Her mouth opened, and I woke up gasping. The dripping sound was louder now, echoing through the apartment. When I turned on the light, I saw her. She was sitting at the foot of my bed, her wet hair hanging over her face. In her hands, she held the locket, the chain wrapped tightly around her fingers. Her head lifted slowly, and I saw her face clearly for the first time. It was me. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Then she stood, water spilling onto the floor, and walked toward the door. She didn't look back, but as she reached the hallway, she dropped the locket. It hit the floor with a metallic clang, and then she was gone. I don't know who she is, or what she wants. The locket sits on my nightstand now, cold and silent. But the dripping sound hasn't stopped, and every time I close my eyes, I feel the weight of water dragging me down. My apartment building wasn't anything fancy, just your standard 6-story walk-up with an elevator that worked when it felt like it. Usually, I took the stairs, but that night, I was exhausted. I'd stayed late at work trying to finish a report, and by the time I got home, my legs felt like lead. So, against my better judgment, I stepped into the rattling old box and hit the button for the 4th floor. The doors slid shut, and the elevator began its familiar, jerky ascent. Everything seemed normal until it didn't stop. The digital display blinked 4 for a moment, then jumped to 7. My building didn't have a 7th floor. The elevator doors slid open, revealing a hallway that shouldn't exist. The walls were a stark, blinding white, and the floor was covered in a plush, gray carpet that looked brand new. Soft, ambient light emanated from nowhere in particular, casting everything in an unsettling, shadowless glow. I leaned out cautiously. "Hello?" My voice echoed, too loud in the sterile silence. No response. I should have gone back down, but something about the hallway pulled at me, an almost magnetic curiosity. Against my better judgment, I stepped out. The elevator doors slid shut behind me with a ding, and when I turned around, the elevator was gone. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions. No doors, no windows, just the same white walls and gray carpet as far as I could see. I tried walking one way, then the other, but it didn't seem to matter. Every few minutes, I passed the same scuff mark on the carpet, the same faint crack in the wall. It was like I was stuck in a loop. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Faint at first, but growing louder, echoing down the hall. My heart raced as I turned in a slow circle, trying to pinpoint the direction. "Who's there?" I called out. The footsteps stopped. I waited, every muscle in my body tense. Just when I thought I might have imagined it, the sound started again. Faster now, as if someone, or something, was running toward me. Panic set in. I sprinted down the hallway, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Ahead of me, a door materialized out of nowhere. It was sleek and black, a stark contrast to the blinding whiteness of the walls. Without hesitation, I threw it open and stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind me. The room was small and dimly lit, with a single chair in the center. On the chair sat a man. He was slouched forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped together. His face was obscured by shadows, but I could see his suit, charcoal gray, perfectly tailored, not a wrinkle in sight. "You shouldn't be here," he said without looking up. "I didn't mean to," I started, but he cut me off. "It doesn't matter. They'll find you now." "Who?" My voice cracked. "Who's going to find me?" He finally looked up, and my stomach dropped. His face was wrong. Not disfigured or monstrous, just off in a way I couldn't put into words. His features didn't quite line up, like they'd been rearranged by someone who'd never seen a human before. His eyes were too far apart, his mouth too wide, his skin unnervingly smooth. "You have to go back," he said, "before it's too late." "I don't know how," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He stood, towering over me, and reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small, silver key and held it out. "Take this. Use it to find the door." Before I could ask what he meant, the walls began to shake. A deep, rumbling sound filled the air, and the light in the room flickered. "They're coming," the man said, his voice urgent. "Go now." I grabbed the key and bolted back into the hallway. The once endless corridor was different now, darker, the walls stained with something that looked like oil. The air was heavy, oppressive, and the footsteps were back, louder, faster, closer. I ran, clutching the key so tightly it bit into my palm. Ahead, I saw another door, this one smaller and more worn, like it had been there for centuries. I didn't hesitate. I shoved the key into the lock and turned it, throwing the door open just as the footsteps reached me. I fell through and landed hard on cold tile. When I looked up, I was back in the lobby of my building. The elevator dinged, and the doors slid open, as if nothing had happened. I scrambled to my feet and bolted up the stairs to my apartment. Inside, everything looked normal, but when I pulled the silver key out of my pocket, it was warm, almost pulsing in my hand. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the hallway, the man in the chair, the dark shapes that had been chasing me. And then there was the key. I left it on my kitchen counter, but when I checked the next morning, it was gone. Things haven't been the same since. Sometimes, when I take the elevator, it hesitates, the doors lingering on floors that don't exist. Other times, I catch glimpses of the man in the corner of my vision, just for a second before he vanishes. And then there are the footsteps. Always faint, always distant, but growing louder every night. I don't think they've given up. I think they're just waiting for the right moment. Not a normal knock, 3 short, sharp raps, each spaced exactly 2 seconds apart. I checked the clock. It was 2:13 a.m. I live alone, in a quiet apartment building where nothing ever happens. My neighbors keep to themselves, and the hallway cameras haven't caught so much as a delivery mishap in years. But that night, someone was out there. I crept to the peephole, my heart pounding in my chest. The hallway was empty. Another knock. This time, it came from the back door of my kitchen, which didn't make sense because I live on the 3rd floor and there's no balcony back there. I didn't check that door. I couldn't. Instead, I stayed up the rest of the night, armed with a kitchen knife and a flashlight, jumping at every sound. But nothing else happened. When the sun rose, I convinced myself it was just a weird dream or a prank. The next night, it happened again. 3 knocks at the front door. Then, a few minutes later, 3 knocks at the back. This time, I worked up the courage to check the kitchen. Slowly, I approached the door, the knife clutched in my sweaty hand. The air was still, thick with that strange middle-of-the-night quiet when the world feels too big and too empty. When I opened the door, there was nothing there. Just the railing overlooking the alley below. But on the floor, propped neatly against the threshold, was an envelope. I picked it up, hesitating before opening it. My name was written across the front in neat, looping cursive, but no address, no stamp, nothing to suggest how it had gotten there. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 5 words. Do you remember the tunnel? The tunnel. It was like a switch flipped in my brain, pulling me back to a memory I hadn't touched in years. I was 12. My best friend at the time, Danny, had dared me to crawl through an old drainage tunnel near the woods behind our neighborhood. The inside was pitch black, the air damp and cold, but I didn't want to seem scared, so I went first. About halfway through, I thought I heard something behind me, something scratching, breathing. When I turned to look, Danny wasn't there anymore. I screamed his name, my voice echoing down the narrow concrete walls. A moment later, I saw his face, pale, wide-eyed, peeking into the tunnel's entrance. He'd run back outside, too afraid to follow. We never talked about it after that. He moved away a few years later, and life went on. But standing in my kitchen with that letter in my hand, I realized I wasn't the one who'd written it off. I'd buried the memory, shoved it into a dark corner of my mind where I didn't have to think about what might have been in that tunnel with me. The knocking continued every night after that. Sometimes it was at the front door, sometimes the back, sometimes both at once. But it always followed the same pattern. 3 precise knocks, spaced 2 seconds apart. Each time, there'd be another letter waiting for me. It's not too late. You should have stayed. It never left. I stopped sleeping. I stopped going to work. The letters piled up on my coffee table, each one worse than the last, like the writer knew exactly how to unravel me. Then, one night, the knocking stopped. I waited, tense and trembling, for it to start again. But instead, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a text from an unknown number. Come outside. I almost threw my phone across the room. But instead, against every shred of self-preservation I had left, I went to the window and peeked through the blinds. The street below was empty, except for the tunnel. It shouldn't have been there. My apartment was miles from the woods, and yet, somehow, the tunnel from my childhood was standing in the middle of the street, its dark mouth gaping open like it had been waiting for me all these years. The phone buzzed again. You owe it this. I didn't want to go. Every cell in my body screamed at me to lock my doors, call someone, do anything but leave. But my legs moved on their own, dragging me down the stairs and into the cold night air. The tunnel loomed ahead, impossibly dark. I could feel it pulling at me, its presence like gravity, heavy and inescapable. Inside, the air smelled wet and metallic, like rust and damp earth. I couldn't see the end. The deeper I went, the louder the silence became, pressing against my ears, suffocating me. That's when I heard it. The scratching. At first, it was faint, like the sound of rats scuttling through the walls. But as I moved deeper, it grew louder, sharper, until it sounded like claws raking against concrete. I wanted to turn back, but the tunnel wouldn't let me. The walls seemed to close in, the air thickening until I could barely breathe. Then, up ahead, I saw it. A figure. It was crouched low, its back to me, its body unnaturally long and twisted. Its skin was pale, stretched tight over jagged bones, and its head turned slowly, too slowly, until its face, no, its mouth, looked at me. It was grinning. Not a smile, not even a smirk. It was a full, unnatural grin that split its face in half, teeth glinting in the dim light. "You came back," it said, in a voice that sounded like gravel being crushed. I don't remember running. I don't remember getting back to my apartment. All I know is that when I woke up, I was on my living room floor. The letters gone, the knocking stopped. But last night, I noticed something. In the corner of my bedroom, just at the edge of my vision, there's a shadow. It doesn't move, but I can feel it watching. And sometimes, late at night, I hear scratching.